Empire. The war ended last night, Caroline. Help me with these flowers. Elizabeth Cameron stood in the open French window holding a large blue and white china vase filled with roses, somewhat showily past their prime. Caroline helped her hostess carry the heavy vase into the long, cool, dim drawing room. At 40, Mrs. Cameron was, to Caroline's youthful eye, very old indeed. Nevertheless, she was easily the handsomest of America's great ladies, and certainly the most serenely efficient. "One must always be up at dawn in August," Mrs. Cameron sounded to Caroline rather like Julius Caesar reporting home. "Servants, like flowers, tend to wilt. We shall be 37 for lunch. Do you intend to marry, Dell?" "I don't think I shall ever marry anyone." Caroline frowned with pleasure at Mrs. Cameron's directness. Although Caroline thought of herself as American, she had actually lived most of her life in Paris, and so had little contact with women like Elizabeth Sherman Cameron, the perfect modern American lady. When Dell asked Caroline to join the house party at Surrend and Daring, deep in the English countryside, she had not even pretended to give the matter thought. She had come straight on from Paris with a single night at Brown's Hotel in London. That was Friday, and the United States and Spain had been at war for 3 exciting months. Now, apparently, the war was over. She tried to recall the date. Was it August 12th or August 13th, 1898? "You would make a good wife for Dell," Mrs. Cameron said. "But would he make a good husband for me? Because I want to live forever in America now that Father's dead." Caroline heard herself say rather more than she intended. Through the tall window she could see her co-host, Don Cameron, on the grassy lower terrace. Senator Cameron was a red-faced, heavily mustached, but modestly bearded man, older by a quarter-century than his wife. As Mrs. Cameron could not abide him, she treated him with exquisite courtesy and deference, just as she treated in a rather cool and off-handed way Caroline's other co-host, the equally ancient Henry Adams, who entirely adored her, as she entirely accepted him. "Forever is a long time, but if I had forever to spend somewhere, it wouldn't be there, let me tell you. It would be Paris." "Well, since I've spent most of my life so far in Paris, home looks all the greener, I suppose." "May you find it so," said Mrs. Cameron vaguely, her attention now distracted by the cook, an elderly woman who was at the door with the day's menus to be discussed. "Oh, cook, what a triumph last night." Senator Cameron admired, and couldn't stop eating, the sweet potatoes. "Impossible things he gives me to prepare." In a long dress, the cook looked like an abbess in a novel by Scott. Mrs. Cameron laughed without much joy. "We must do our best to please, all of us. My husband," she turned to Caroline, "hates English food, so he sends home to Pennsylvania for everything we eat. Tonight we shall have corn." "But which is it, ma'am?" The cook looked desperate, the Abbey besieged. "It is green and cylindrical, and should be shucked of its covering and boiled, but not too long. We'll have the watermelon with the other fruits. I trust you with the rest, dear cook." "But—" the abbess wailed, and fled. Mrs. Cameron sat on a sofa beneath a Millet portrait of a lady of the previous generation, and looked, in her yellowy white lace, as if she too belonged to that earlier time, before the new era of loud clattering railroads, sinister silent telegraphs, garish electric lights. "I allow the servants exactly 8% for graft, but not a penny more. As there is no reforming them or anyone else, I believe in keeping graft to an agreed-upon but never mentioned figure." "My father could never bear the commission servants take," Caroline said. "But then he never got used to France." In fact, Caroline's father, Colonel Sanford, had refused, on what he claimed to be moral grounds, ever to speak French. He thought the French indecent, and their language an intricate trap laid for American innocence. During the Colonel's long widowhood, a series of intensely moral English, Swiss, and German ladies had interpreted for him, pale successors to Caroline's mother Emma, the Princesse d'Agrigent, alleged by all to have been vivid. She had died not long after Caroline's birth. She had been dark. For Caroline, Emma was not even a memory, only a portrait in the main salon of their chateau, Saint-Cloud-le-Duc. Mrs. Cameron was now ablaze with August light. "Why did your father exile himself?" "I've never known. But of course Caroline and one of her half-brothers, Blaise Delacroix Sanford, had their suspicions. It was after he married my mother. You see, she was really French. I mean, she was born in Italy, but her first husband was French. She was born a Schermerhorn Schuyler." Mrs. Cameron was prompt. Everyone knew everyone else's connections in the grand American world, so unlike Paris. Mrs. Cameron wanted to know what would become of the Colonel's celebrated place at St. Cloud. Caroline said truthfully that she did not know. Everything has been left to Blaise and me, but the will hasn't been properly— what is the word? Probated. Let us hope the division will be equal. Oh, I'm sure it probably is. But Caroline had her doubts. Over the years, Colonel Sanford had progressed from pronounced eccentricity to the edge of madness. Obliging the butler to double as taster at mealtimes, the Colonel feared poison. In the warm weather, the Colonel preferred daughter to son. Then, just as the leaves started to turn, he preferred son to daughter. During alternating equinoxes, new wills would be drawn. As luck would have it, he had died in cold weather, when the horse he was riding across the railroad track at St. Cloud shied and threw him in the path of the blue train itself. Death was swift. That was a year ago, and the lawyers in New York were still unraveling the various wills. In September, Caroline and Blaise would know who had got what.
Later, as Caroline moved to the great table between the terrace windows to write her half-brother a letter, Del Hay came in. His father, John Hay, American ambassador to the court of St. James and former private secretary to President Lincoln, was the house celebrity. Del was very like his mother, Clara, a heavy, large-boned, handsome woman who had also produced two daughters, Helen and Alice.
"We've won the war," said Del. As a general greeting, I prefer good morning. Caroline was cool. "So far today, everyone's told me that we've won the war, and no one's mentioned the weather. Besides, I haven't won the war. You and your father have. You, too. You're an American. Oh, it's a great day for all of us. A very hot day. I'm writing your former classmate. Any message? Tell him he should be happy. At least his employer should be. The New York Journal must be frothing at the mouth like some rabid eagle," Caroline finished. She had yet to hear anything good of the Journal or its proprietor, the wealthy young Californian William Randolph Hearst, whose mother had recently inherited a fortune from his near-illiterate father, Senator George Hearst, a crude discoverer of gold and silver mines in the West. It was the senator who had set up his cherished only son as a newspaper proprietor, first with the Daily Examiner in San Francisco and then with the Morning Journal in New York, where young Hearst had spectacularly succeeded through a form of sensational journalism known as yellow, fires, alarms, scandals, in surpassing Mr. Pulitzer's original yellow New York World. The Journal was now, in its own words, the most popular newspaper on earth. "Blaise delights in Mr. Hearst," said Caroline, "and I delight in hearing about Mr. Hearst." "But you've never met him?" "Oh, no. He's not to be met, I gather. He goes to Rector's with actresses. Two very young actresses, I'm told. Sisters. He's a cad." Del said the final word. There would be no appeal. "So why does Blaise work for him?" "Oh, Miss Sanford, has no one told you yet about power?" "I read Julius Caesar's handbook in school. I know all about it. You start at first light, and then, by forced marches, you surprise the enemy and kill them. Then you write a book about what you've done. Well, the newspapers are now the book you write. Blaise has simply taken a shortcut. He's gone straight to the end result." "But isn't it better, if that's what you want, to win a war first?" Caroline asked. "But that's exactly what Mr. Hearst has done, or thinks he's done. All those stories of his about how the Spanish blew up our battleship. Didn't they?" "Probably not, according to Father. But it's the way that things are made to look that matters now. Anyway, Blaise is in the middle of it. He wants to be powerful. We all noticed that." "Don't you?" "I'm far too easygoing. I'd rather marry, be happy, like my father." Caroline returned to her room and dressed for lunch. She had come to Kent without a maid. Old Marguerite had gone to Vichy to take the waters. In the past, Caroline had always traveled with a mademoiselle, who was half governess and half maid. But now, in her 21st year, Caroline was an orphan, and she could do as she pleased. The problem was that she was not certain where pleasure for her might ultimately lie. In any case, until the Sanford estate was settled, she was in limbo, and so she had chosen to spend August with Del and his family at the summer embassy presided over by the Camerons and the Porcupinus Angelicus, their name for Henry Adams, who was indeed prickly as a porcupine, if not always much like an angel. But happily, Adams was now in a celestial mood, at least with Caroline, who found him alone in the yellow drawing-room. At 60, Adams, grandson and great-grandson of presidents, as he was inexorably identified, possessed a full white beard, carefully barbered to a point, A full mustache, a high, pink, shining bald head, and a full paunch held ever so slightly forward in order to balance properly the small, round figure that existed only to support the large, round, brain-crammed head of America's great historian, wit, dispenser of gloom. Dear Miss Sanford, you do illuminate at least one sexagenarian summer. Mr. Adams, Caroline mocked a reverent curtsy, is the war concluded to your satisfaction? Well, it's all over, which satisfies me. I knew we had our man of destiny securely in place. Commodore Dewey? Oh, infant, commodores are simply playthings in wartime. But he took Manila and defeated the Spanish fleet, and now everyone wants us to stay, at least the English do. Adams tugged at the tip of his pointed beard. We students of history, no matter how dull, like to know just who it was who put an admiral, like a chess piece, in far eastern waters, soon to be called far western, as what's west to us is what's true west. My brother Blaise says it was Mr. Roosevelt, when he was at the Navy Department. Caroline wondered if all Americans, of this particular set anyway, were obliged to speak of Theodore Roosevelt, now running for the governorship of New York at least 6 times a day, rather the way convent nuns told their beads at regular intervals. Adams nodded approvingly. You are getting closer. Our young, bumptious friend Theodore, a student of my young, bumptious brother Brooks, deserves more credit, certainly, than the knight, admiral, that is, I think in chess terms, that checkmated Spain. But whose hand directed our castle, Theodore? I am in suspense, Mr. Adams. Who is the consummate player? Our first man of destiny since Mr. Lincoln. The president. Who else? The major himself. Mr. McKinley. Don't laugh. Adams frowned severely. I know he is supposed to be a creature of Mark Hanna and all the other bosses, but it's plain to me that they are his creatures. They find him money, a useful art, so that he can deliver us an empire, which he has. The timing is exquisite, too. Just as weak England begins to loosen her grip on the world, just as Germany and Russia and Japan are jostling one another to take England's place, the Major preempts them all, and the Pacific Ocean is ours, or soon will be, and the new poles of power will be Russia on the eastern landmass, and the United States on the west, with England, ours at last, in between. Oh, to be your age, Miss Sanford, and to see the coming wonders of our Augustan age. In Paris, Mr. Adams, you once told me that you were a lifelong pessimist. That was on Earth. I am now in heaven, dear Miss Sanford, and so my pessimism ended with my earthly life.
After lunch for the house guests, where boiled beef relentlessly followed fowl, John Hay received a telegram from President McKinley appointing him the new Secretary of State. Caroline, who had escaped the party in order to explore the woods below the house, was eventually recalled to it by Dell, who presented her with a telegram of her own.
It was from her cousin and lawyer, John Apgar Sanford, who urged, "Come to New York fastest. Will to be probated September 15. Don't worry." "What is it?" Dell asked. "I've been told not to worry. About something. I suppose that means I should be very worried." "Are you?" Caroline put the telegram inside her reticule and chose not to answer Dell. She took his arm. "Can the embassy get me on a ship? To New York?" "Of course. When?" "Tomorrow evening, if possible, or the next day." "What's happened?" "Nothing. That is, nothing yet. It's just business," she added lightly, and paused for fear of stammering before the B, something she was prone to do when nervous. Blaise Delacroix Sanford had little appetite for food and less for drink, and so he had got into the habit of turning the lunch hour into a long walk up Fifth Avenue, starting at the Journal office and ending with a visit to the Hoffman House bar in Madison Square. Here he would drink a mug of beer and dine off the vast buffet. As he studied the stout burghers who came and went talking business, he was relieved to see none of his fellow journalists. Although he enjoyed their company to a point, that point was often too swiftly reached whenever a bottle was produced. There was a mild stir in the bar as the former Democratic President Grover Cleveland shook a number of hands absently, and then took the arm of the smooth Republican Chauncey Depew, and together they vanished into an alcove. Who'd think they were once mortal enemies? Blaise turned and found himself looking into the handsome, if somewhat slant-eyed face of his Yale classmate, Payne Whitney. The young men shook hands. Blaise knew that although his classmates considered him somewhat scandalous for not bothering to graduate, he was thought to be highly enterprising, in a criminal sort of way, for having gone to work for William Randolph Hearst, known by his employees as the Chief and the Morning Journal. At 35, Hearst was the most exciting figure in journalism, and Blaze, who craved excitement, American excitement, had got himself introduced to the Chief. When Blaze had said that he had left Yale, just as Hearst had left Harvard, in order to learn the newspaper business, the Chief had been non-committal. But when the Chief had learned that young Mr. Sanford was heir to a considerable fortune, he had smiled, boyishly, and welcomed him into the bosom of the Journal. Blaze sold advertising, rewrote stories, did a bit of everything. He had been bitterly disappointed when the Chief had not taken him to Cuba to enjoy Hearst's victory over Spain. Theodore Roosevelt may have won a small battle, but everyone conceded that Hearst had himself started and won a small war. Without Hearst's relentlessly specious attacks on Spain, the American government would never have gone to war. Of course, the sinking of the Maine in Havana Harbor had been decisive. The plot had been as crude as it was lurid. A ship of a friendly nation on a friendly visit to a restive Spanish colony sinks as the result of a mysterious explosion, with the loss of many American lives. Who, or what, was responsible? Hearst had managed to convince most Americans that the Spanish had deliberately done the deed, but those who knew something of the matter were reasonably certain that the Spanish had nothing to do with the explosion. Either the ship had exploded from a spontaneous combustion in the coal bins, or a floating mine had accidentally hit a bulkhead, or Hearst himself had caused the Maine to be blown up so that he could increase the Journal's circulation with his exciting, on-the-spot coverage of the war. Currently, Hearst was involved in an even more fascinating plot. At 1:30, Blaze, a principal in the plot, was to report to the Chief at the Worth House, where Hearst lived in unlonely bachelor splendor. Payne Whitney wanted to know what Hearst's next move might be. Blaze said that he was not at liberty to say, which caused a degree of satisfying annoyance. "I've heard from Dell in England. He said your sister, half-sister," Blaze always said, and did not himself know why, "was visiting the same house. I think Dell likes her. I think Caroline likes him, too, but she does not exactly share her heart with me. I suppose they're all coming back now, Mr. Hayes, Secretary of State, just as I was about to go over and start my grand tour. Oh, this is the grand tour." Blaze, perhaps too Gallically, used both hands to embrace the Hoffman House bar. Payne Whitney laughed. "Well, you were born on the grand tour. I haven't made mine yet." He finished his cocktail and said goodbye.
Blaze headed for Hearst's offices at the Worth House, where he was greeted by George Thompson, a plump blond man in frock coat and striped trousers who had once been Hearst's favorite waiter and now kept house for him.
"Mr. Hearst is in the dining room, sir. He says you're to join them for coffee." "Who's them?" "He's with Senator Platt, sir, just the two of them." Hearst was 6 feet 2 inches tall, heavily built, and not very well put together to Blaze's critical eye. But then Blaze was a natural athlete, and though only 5 feet 9 inches tall, he carried himself like a circus acrobat, according to Caroline. On Hearst's right sat the white-haired, benign Senator Platt, the Republican boss of New York State. Although Hearst himself was nominally a Democrat, he dealt even-handedly with politicians of every sort. They needed him. He needed them. But the Chief was not to be taken for granted. To everyone's amazement, in the election of '96, he had not supported his father's friend McKinley. Instead, Hearst attacked him as a puppet of the archetype Ohio boss Mark Hanna. He also tried to get Payne Whitney's father to be the Democratic candidate. But when it was plain that William Whitney could not be nominated, the young William Jennings Bryan took the convention by storm. Bryan was a formidable populist orator who had but one speech, the Cross of Gold, on which the wealthy had crucified the American people, and the only way to get them down from the cross would be to increase the money supply by coining silver at a rate of 16 silver units to 1 of gold. Although every businessman in the country regarded Bryan as not only mad but potentially revolutionary, Hearst Journal had been the only major paper in New York to support the Democrats. As George pulled out a chair for Blaze to sit at Hearst's left, Senator Platt said, "I knew your father." "I heard him speak of you many times, Senator," said Blaze, whose father had never mentioned Platt. After Senator Platt's confession, Blaze's lie, the room was silent except for the sound of George filling coffee cups. Plainly, the Chief and the Republican boss had exhausted their small talk, while their big talk could never be shared with someone as junior as Blaze. The senator took a cigar from the box that George offered him. Then he asked, "Are you a Methodist, Mr. Sanford?" "No, sir, we are My half-sister and I, Catholic. Ah, France, I suppose, all those years. Explains why you're a Democrat like Mr. Hearst. Oh, Blaze and I aren't what you'd call good party men. If we were, we wouldn't be breaking bread with the Republican Tsar of New York, Hearst said. There are times when serious men must unite. That's why I thought you'd cotton on to Theodore, Platt pointed out to the two men. Well, we invented him. Hearst was sour. But then Theodore Roosevelt was the only man that the chief ever showed signs of envying. Theodore was only 6 years older than Hearst, yet he was now being given credit for Admiral Dewey's conquest of the Philippines, while his own victory in the field at Kettle Hill had been played up by Hearst himself as a battle equal to Yorktown or Gettysburg, and all for the sake of increasing the journal's circulation in the real war, which was against not Spain, but Pulitzer's rival paper, The World. Yes, you invented him, all right, and I had to take him. I'm sorry you don't see your way to helping out, Platt said. We're committed to the Democrats this time. We're for Judge Van Wyck, all the way. After another long silence, the senator rose and departed, and Blaze followed Hearst into his study. You bring the latest dispatches from Paris? Blaze gave the chief a series of cables which had arrived that morning from France. Since January, the chief had had his heart set on what Blaze thought of as the French caper. The plan was nothing less than the removal from Devil's Island of the world's most celebrated prisoner, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew, who had been accused, falsely according to Hearst and half the world, of giving French military secrets to the Germans. Although the case had been reopened in Paris, and the actual spy supposedly identified, the French General Staff would not admit that justice, no matter how skewed by fashionable anti-Semitism, had miscarried. They acquitted the actual spy, and kept Dreyfus in solitary confinement on Devil's Island. Blaze felt that he should interpret the latest news from Paris. The government's just promised a new trial for Dreyfus. Court-martial is the phrase I heard. They'll drag it out another year at least. We need a good story for this fall. Before November, before election. This should do in Roosevelt. How can you and Captain Dreyfus lose him an election in New York State? Hearst opened very wide his pale blue eyes. Don't you see it's all the same? Teddy winning a battle that was already won, but getting the credit because he is who he is, and all the newspaper boys were right there with him because I'm selling the war to the world. He couldn't lose because I couldn't lose. Well, if I break into Devil's Island and free that poor innocent Jew, why, no one will pay any more attention to Teddy. He'll be last summer's news, while I'm this fall's news. And so, Van Wyck gets elected. In a lunatic way, Blaze saw the point. Hearst's meddling in French internal affairs, successful or not, would certainly be a sensation, and a diversion from the election. You think you like publishing? Oh, yes. Blaze was as enthusiastic as he sounded. I think it's more exciting than anything else, especially the journal. Well, I have my critics. I've also pretty much used up my mother's present. These wars can cost you a lot of money. Ask her for more. Blaze was brisk. He saw what was coming. I don't like to. The chief scratched his chin, then his ears. I saw a hodling yesterday. Tells me your father's will is coming up for probate. Well, it's a slow process. It might not be before the first of the year. Anyway, there are two of us, my half-sister, and me. Now is the time to get in on the ground floor, said Hearst. I've got my eye on Chicago, Washington, Boston. I want a paper in every city. Aren't I sort of young to be a partner? Well, no one said anything about you being a partner. I guess you could certainly buy an interest. Well, yes, I guess I could. But Blaze had spent enough time with the journal's dispensers of red ink to know that everything belonged to Hearst, personally. And there was, thus far, no sort of interest that could be sold. Blaze chose not to press the matter. He had his own plan, which might or might not include the chief. More to the point, I really don't know how much I'm going to end up with, or for how long, he added cryptically. Well, that's your affair. George was at the door. Miss Anita Wilson and Miss Millicent Wilson to see you, sir. Tell them to wait in the parlor. As Blaze walked down the hall, he saw the Wilson sisters staring at themselves in a mirrored screen in the parlor. They were plump, pretty, blonde. At the paper there were those who thought that the chief favored Millicent, who was only 16. Others thought that he preferred the older Anita. A few thought he enjoyed each of them, either separately or together, according to what degree the imagination of the speculating journalist had been depraved. As George opened the front door for Blaze, the chief must have entered the parlor because there were delighted cries. "Oh, Mr. Hearst, we never dreamed there was that much chocolate in the world!" The voices were tough Hell's Kitchen Irish. Hearst's response was not audible. Blaze stepped into the elevator.
Later, as Blaze walked along Park Row, he was hailed by Dennis Hoteling, the Sanford family lawyer. Since Blaze had known Hoteling all his life, it had been only natural that he retain him to probate the last of his father's wills. Hoteling told Blaze that he had just been with the clerk of wills, where all was well as far as the law was concerned. He then broke the news that John Apgar Sanford was representing Caroline in contesting their interpretation of the last will.
Blaze felt a sudden chill of anger. Representing Caroline? Why? We're not in court. There's no contest. There will be, he says, over the precise age at which she comes into her share of the estate. The will says that when she's 27, she'll inherit her share of the capital. Until then, I have control of the entire estate. After all, Father wrote that will himself with his own hand. Unfortunately, he wrote his will in rather faulty French, and since the French number 1 looks just like an English 7, though unlike a French 7, your cousin is taking the position that the Colonel intended this will to conform with the earlier ones, and that your father meant for Caroline to inherit at 21, not 27, half the estate. Well, it looks like 27 to me. How did it look to the clerk? I translated the text for him. Of course, the English version says 27. So what's the problem? Blaze asked. Twofold. Your cousin says that we have deliberately misinterpreted your father, and he will now contest our interpretation of the figure. He will. How can he? Only Caroline can, and she's 3,000 miles away. Your first supposition is correct. He obviously cannot contest a will with which he has nothing to do. Your second supposition, the geographical one, is mistaken. I have just spoken to your sister. She arrived this morning from Liverpool. She is stopping at the Waldorf Astoria. Blaze stared at the old lawyer. If they contest what my father wrote, I shall take them through every court in the country. Do you understand, Mr. Hoteling? Of course. Perhaps it would be more seemly to come to an agreement. A compromise, say, a settlement. She must wait for her share. That's what my father wanted. That's what I want. That's what it's going to be. Yes, sir. Thus, the crown passed from Colonel Sanford to Blaze, who was now sole steward for the next 6 years of $15 million. Caroline had not realized the extent of her own courage as she walked, all alone, in Peacock Alley, a corridor as long as that block of 34th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues, which was encased by the magnificence of New York's newest and most celebrated hotel, the Waldorf Astoria. She had been warned that no proper young lady could ever be seen alone in Peacock Alley, but as she was there to meet a gentleman, she would not be alone for very long, and so she took pleasure in the interest that she, and her Paris gown, designed by Worth, aroused as she proceeded from lobby to palm court, all eyes upon her progress. 2/3 of the way down the alley, John Apgar Sanford sprang to his feet. Promptly his head vanished in the fronds of the palm tree that shaded his chair. "Are you hiding from me?" asked Caroline, delighted. No. Sanford emerged from the fronds, his thin curly hair in disarray. He shook her hand gravely. He had her father's small mouth. Were they second or third cousins? But the rest of him was all his own, or an inheritance from ancestors not shared with Caroline. At 33, he lived with a chronically ill wife in Merry Hill. I've made a reservation in the Palm Garden. How was your trip? When not terrifying, very dull. There is no middle way on a ship. How wonderful. The Palm Garden was a wonderful jungle of palm trees set in green Chinese cash pots. Caroline took his arm protectively, and together they followed the head waiter to a table set in front of a gold velvet banquette for two, on which they could sit side by side, close enough to be able to speak in low voices, far enough apart to emphasize the innocent decency of their relationship in the eyes of that considerable portion of the great world, having tea in the Palm Garden. Tea was brought them, followed by liveried waiters bearing cakes. Sanford placed a thick envelope on the table between them, opened it, withdrew some documents. "I have gone on appeal. There are the documents in question. Read them carefully. I've also obliged Mr. Hotling to produce the Colonel's earlier wills for comparison. In every will I know of, each of you was to inherit his half of the estate at the age of 21. But in the last will, Father appears to have written a 7 instead of a 1. Surely if I'm not to inherit till I'm 27, then the same condition, that is, the same confused cipher, must apply to Blaise, who is only 22. Look." Sanford tapped the document. She read, "My son Blaise, who is of age to inherit his portion, my daughter Caroline, when she is of age, at 27, to inherit her portion, as described above." Caroline put down the will. "This makes no sense. I was 20 when he made the will. Blaise was 21, and Father says he is of age. So why am I not of age when I am 21, as the previous will stated? You know, I know, Blaise knows, Mr. Hotling knows, that Colonel Sanford meant 21. But the law does not know this. The law knows only what is written down and witnessed and notarized." "What can I do?" she asked. "What do you want?" "My half of the estate, now." "That will mean going to court. An expensive process. If I should lose, what happens?" "You will be paid from the estate $30,000 a year until you are 27. Then you will inherit your half. Suppose Blaise loses it all. Then what? You will have half of nothing. So I must get my share now. We must find a way to force Blaise to give up what's not his. I think a court case might be risky." Caroline involuntarily shuddered. Anger and fear commingled. "Surrender is riskier. Isn't this the city where everyone can be bought? Well, let us buy a judge. Or is it the jury one pays for?" Sanford smiled to show that he was not shocked, and looked very shocked indeed. "Our city officials are generally corrupt," he said, "but I wouldn't know how to deal with that sort of thing." The string trio, as if cued, began to play the song of the year, the sickening, to Caroline's Parisian ear, the Rosary. Sentimental religiosity and public stealing. That was the new world. Well, she decided, she had better master it, or be mastered herself. "Will you see your brother?" Caroline rose. "Blaise is taking me to the theater. Then we shall go to supper, the two of us, at Rector's, which I can now enter, as I am a woman of 21, though not yet an heiress of 27. Caroline saw that she had made her point. Sanford nodded, looked grim. He would do battle for her. As they swept into the Peacock Alley, Sanford said, "You must be very careful what you say to your brother." "I always am. But he does know that we mean to fight, doesn't he?" "Yes, I've made that clear to Mr. Hotling. Perhaps you shouldn't mention the matter to Blaise." "Perhaps," she said.
Caroline and Blaise attended the theater, then continued to Rector's, where they were served oysters and champagne, and managed not to mention the will. Hearst appeared, with the two Mrs. Wilson, and, after meeting Caroline, asked if she wanted to see the journal put to bed.
"I thought the journal never slept," said Caroline. "It goes to bed when they make it up, the front page, for the last time before they print." Blaise was helpful. Hearst was forceful. "Come on." The Mrs. Wilson continued to smile in unison. Hearst took Caroline's arm, most politely. A perilous old elevator operated by an ancient Negro took them to the second floor of the Tribune building, where several men were still at work in a long, ink-smelling room, rather like a livery stable, except that instead of bridles and saddles attached to the walls or mounted on saw-horses, there were long sheets of galley paper, drawings, photographs. The editor, Willis Abbott, presided over a mock-up of the front page whose principal headline advised the reader that President McKinley was to make a major address on the Philippines in St. Louis. "Oh, no," said Hearst mildly. "Unless we can tell them something they don't know, like he's going to annex the whole place or burn down Manila." With both amusement and awe, Caroline watched as Hearst put a number of strips of text and squares of illustrations on the floor, and then got down on his knees, and like a child happy with a puzzle, began to create, no other word, the next day's news. But news was not the right word. This was not news, but entertainment for the masses. A murder at the bottom of the page began inexorably to move higher and higher up the page. A drawing of the murdered woman found its way to the page's center while the president sank to the page's bottom, and a statement by Secretary of State Hay moved to the third page. "The chief's amazing," Blaze murmured in Caroline's ear. "He's like a painter." "But is it always murder first?" Caroline's voice was low, but Hearst, now on all fours, heard her. "We also like a good fire." "And a good war," said Mr. Abbott dutifully. Hearst sat on his heels, a strand of blonde, dull hair in one eye. "Mr. Abbott, wasn't the murdered woman found nude?" "Actually, no, Chief. She was wearing a sort of gingham dress." "Make that a slip." "A torn slip." "We're also giving too much space to that dude Roosevelt. Remember, we're for Van Wyck and sound government and all that." Hearst stood up. On the floor, his masterpiece, the front page for the next morning's edition of the New York Journal. "I've decided on our next president," he said. Everyone looked very solemn. Even Caroline was impressed. "Yes, Chief?" The editor was imperturbable. "Who?" "Admiral Dewey, hero of Manila. You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." "That's as good as don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." "But did Admiral Dewey really say those inspiring words?" Caroline was now caught up in the excitement of inventing history, not to mention of creating presidents. "Well, we said he said it, and I suppose he probably did say something like it. Anyway, he hasn't denied it, and that's what matters." "Is the Admiral a Democrat?" asked Blaze. "Who cares? I'm sure he doesn't." "But," asked Caroline, "does he want to be president?" "Oh, everyone does over here. That's why we call ourselves a democracy. Fact. Just about anyone can be president, particularly if the Journal promotes him right." Blaze drove Caroline back to the Waldorf Astoria, escorted her to the suite where old Marguerite, in her nightdress, greeted him with a cascade of pent-up French. "She will not learn English," said Caroline, presenting Blaze with a new bottle of brandy, which he opened. As he filled a glass for each, Marguerite delivered herself of a tirade celebrating the beauties and comforts of Saint-Cloud-le-Duc as contrasted with the horrors of New York. Then she went to bed. "Do you like the Chief?" "I don't think I'd ever find him very easy to like. But he's certainly fascinating to watch, to listen to. Is he so powerful?" Blaze nodded. "He can really make someone president." "But he didn't say someone. He said anyone." "Well, he exaggerates at times." Caroline laughed. "At times? I should think that's his power. He exaggerates all the time." "It sells newspapers." "That's all he cares about?" Blaze refused to be led into deeper waters. "As a publisher, yes. That's what I want to be." "With Mr. Hearst?" "No, I want to be my own Mr. Hearst." "He doesn't know that yet, does he?" "How can you tell?" "The way he treats you. With everyone else he is very grand seigneur. But he treats you as an equal, which means that he expects you to invest money. Perhaps all your money. In his papers." Blaze frowned, not at all boyishly. "I'm not about to make this kind of investment." "But you've allowed him to think you will." "Father meant 27. Blaze struck hard. "Mr. Hotling ought to know. He was his lawyer." Caroline sat very straight in her chair. "It was a lucky accident for you that Father's pen slipped. We both know what he meant. But what I want to know is what you mean. Why do you want my share of the estate? Surely there's enough for both." "There isn't, for what I want to do." "To start a newspaper?" Blaze nodded. "I'm learning how it's done now. When I'm ready, I'll start my own, or buy one." For once, Caroline could not stop herself from smiling. "In competition with Mr. Hearst?" "Why not? He'd understand." "You will lose the entire inheritance." "No," Blaze said, and said no more. "Lose or gain, for 6 years you will have the use of my capital. Then what happens? According to Mr. Hotling, you'll inherit the amount which represents half the estate at the time the will was probated." Caroline had begun to see her way through the labyrinth, and not as a victim, but as the Minotaur. She was not yet sufficiently New York predator to demand living flesh for her dinner. She had begun by wanting what was hers, Now she was eager to take what was his as well. Although family history had always bored her, she was sufficiently intrigued by her father's cryptic references to the fact that Charles Schermerhorn Schuyler, her grandfather, had been an illegitimate son of Aaron Burr. At school, she had had the good luck to have a history teacher who did not, like all the others, disdain American history. Together they had read all that they could, which was not much, about her great-grandfather, who seemed more artist than rogue. And of course Burr was her maternal ancestor, not Blaze's, which gave her an advantage if there should be anything to the laws, or rather whims, of heredity. Burr had been narrowly cheated of the presidency, had been rather less narrowly, to say the most, cheated of the crown of Mexico, had lived long enough to see another illegitimate son, if the gossip was true, become president. Burr had been called a traitor, but in actual fact had been something far worse and more dangerous to his world. A dreamer. Because of this sublime, subversive trait, he had enchanted Caroline. Finally, as Aaron Burr had treated his only legitimate child as if she were a son, so Caroline had vowed when she left Europe for America that she would now become Burr's great-grandson and live out, on the grandest scale possible, that subtle creature's dream of a true civilization, with himself as the center. But where the man Burr had wanted high office, even a crown, his great-grand self-styled son was, after all, unmistakably and completely a woman. And so for Caroline there would be no high office in a nation where only males were allowed to occupy such visible places. Yet there was something far better than mere office, and she had got a glimpse of it that evening on the second floor of the Tribune building. There was, simply, true power. Although money was the source of power in this rude place, what she had seen and heard of Hearst that night had convinced her that the ultimate power is not to preside in a White House or open a parliament while seated on a throne, but to reinvent the world for everyone by giving them the dreams that you wanted them to dream. But first, she must see to her inheritance. She got to her feet. Blaze did the same. "I suppose," she said, "we'll next meet in court." Blaze blinked. "You have no case." "I shall accuse you of altering the will." "I didn't." "I know you didn't. But the accusation will always be there, all your life. Mr. Hearst can afford not to be respectable. You can't. You can't prove a thing. And I'll still win." Blaze turned to go. "Do you know how much litigation costs here? I took the liberty of removing 4 poussins from St. Cloud. They're in London with a dealer. He says they should fetch a marvelous price." "You stole my pictures?" Blaze was white with fury. "I took my pictures. When we divide the estate, evenly, I'll give you your half of what I get from the sale. Meanwhile, I shall be able to buy quite a lot of wonderful American law."
The Senate voted to annex the Philippine Islands. Theodore Roosevelt was elected governor of New York, and the French preempted Hearst's plot by freeing Dreyfus before he could be rescued from Devil's Island. Blaze commiserated with the chief in Hearst's living room, which looked like an auction warehouse. The Worth house was being torn down, and Hearst was looking for new quarters.
"There's a possibility in Chicago," Hearst said, swinging his long legs to the floor. "For a house, sir?" "No, a newspaper, to buy." "The News?" "No, they won't sell. But I could take over another one, cheap." Hearst glanced innocently at Blaze. "That is, cheap for you. Expensive for me right now. Next year my mother's moving back to California." "She won't help?" "She'd rather not, she says. She's already in for maybe 10 million. And there's Washington. The Tribune's close to shutting down. Of course there aren't any votes in the district, but you can always have fun scaring the politicians." Blaze was puzzled. "Votes? I thought you wanted readers." "Well, I want both. I've got New York, San Francisco, and now Chicago. With a bit of luck. The Democratic Party's up for grabs." "You want to grab it?" "Somebody has to. You see, the press has a power that no one understands, including me. But I know how to make it work. To get readers. Votes are something else." "I wonder." The chief stretched his arms. "My mother's met your sister." "Oh." Blaze was guarded. He wanted no one, least of all Hearst, to know about the war between brother and sister. At the moment, they communicated only through lawyers. Caroline had appealed a lower court's ruling. Now they awaited a higher court's decision on the arcana of the ciphers 1 and 7. Meanwhile, to Blaze's surprise, Caroline had settled not in New York, where the courts were, but in Washington, where, presumably, Del Hay was. "You go to Washington," Hearst said. "Take a look at the Tribune. Don't let on you have anything to do with me. Give my regards to your sister." Blaze was delighted with the assignment, less delighted with the thought that he might see Caroline. "If I see her," said Blaze. "She moves in refined circles."
Caroline had arrived at the outermost ring of the Republic's circles when she rented a small brick house on N Street, which ran through a dilapidated part of Georgetown. Since her arrival, Dell had been appointed American Consul General in Pretoria. To her relief, he would not have to leave until fall. She had worked out a plan and needed to learn Washington at every level as quickly as possible.
John Apgar Sanford could not believe it when she told him. He begged her to think twice, to do nothing, to let the law take its course. But she was convinced that she could bring Blaze round in a more startling and satisfying fashion, assuming, of course, that she had Napoleonic luck as well as cunning. But the key to her future was here in a strange tropical city among strangers. She needed Dell and John. She needed all the help that she could get. John, as a cousin, she now called him by his first name, was more than willing to help her, but he was by nature timid. He was also, at last, a widower. One night at Delmonico's showy new restaurant, John had lost his timidity and proposed that once his term of mourning was at an end, she take his hand in marriage. Caroline's eyes had filled with genuine tears. She had done her share of flirting in Paris and London, but aside from Dell, no one, as far as she could determine, had ever wanted to marry her, nor had she met anyone that she wanted to marry. Hence the comfortable image of herself alone and in command of her own life. Yet Caroline had been touched by John's declaration. She would, she had said, have to think it over very carefully, for was not marriage the most important step in a young woman's life? As she began to unfurl all the sentences that she had learned from Marguerite, the theater, novels, she started to laugh, while the tears continued to stream down her face. "What are you laughing at?" John had looked hurt. "Not you, dear John. At myself. In the world. Like this." Dell and his sister Helen had invited Caroline to dinner to celebrate his appointment as Consul General to Pretoria. He chose Wormley's, a small hotel with numerous dining rooms, both small and large. They were joined in a small upstairs dining room by a lean young Westerner named James Burden Day. "He's the Assistant Controller of the United States for the next few hours. He's a Democrat," said Dell, as they took their seats in the low-ceilinged room with its view of the vast granite Treasury building down the street. While they ate, Caroline decided that she could do a lot worse than marry Dell. On the other hand, she could imagine nothing worse than a season, unless it be a year, in Pretoria. Plainly, her interest in him was less than romantic. She had often wondered what it was that other girls meant when they said they were in love, or deeply attracted, or whatever adhesive verb a lady might politely use. Caroline found certain masculine types attractive, as types, quite apart from personality. The young man on her right, addressed by Dell as Jim, was such a one. Dell himself was too much, physically, created in his mother's Baroque mold. But had she not always been taught that fineness of character is the best that any woman could hope for in a mate? And Dell's was incomparably fine. Thinking of Dell's fineness, Caroline turned to the figure on her right. Jim was definitely not Baroque, she decided. Gothic, in fact. Slender, aspiring, lean. Was his character incomparably fine? She was tempted to ask him, but asked instead how a Democrat enjoyed working for a Republican administration. "I like it better than they do, but it's just another job to them. And that's all government is, in this country anyway. Jobs. Mine should belong to a Republican, and it will, in September, when I go home." "To do what?" "To come back here," Dell answered for his friend. "He's running for Congress." Don't tempt the gods. Day looked worried, and Caroline found this appealing. Helen shifted the subject to Newport, Rhode Island, and Day fell silent, and Caroline held her own, as the uses to which the summers should be put were analyzed. Apparently, Helen and her sister Alice planned to divide the Newport season between them, Would Caroline join one or the other of them? Caroline said that she might, if she were invited, but no one, she lied, had invited her. Actually, Mrs. Jack Astor, after making Caroline promise never to play tennis with her husband, had invited her for July, and Caroline had said that everything would depend on the state of some unfinished business. After dinner, Dell put his arm through Caroline's halfway across Lafayette Park. Helen and Day, not touching, were up ahead, long shadows cast in front of them by dull street lamps, which emphasized the sylvan nature of the square's confusion of ill-tended trees and bushes. I suppose I must ask sometime. Dell was nervous. Ask what? Well, would you marry me? I mean, will you marry me? Oh, no, Caroline exclaimed, astonishing both of them. I mean, oh, no, not now. You don't want to go to Pretoria. I can understand that. It's not Pretoria. It's not you. It's me and Blaze and business. We have all summer to do your business in, then. Well, then, anything. I want, she said to her own surprise, to be married. That is, she added, surprising herself for what she hoped would be the last time. You.
Unfinished business began the next day, when Cousin John arrived at Caroline's house in a Herdic cab, a local invention consisting of glass like a royal coach, that took them to E Street and the building that housed the Washington Post and a number of out-of-town newspapers. But their first destination was Gerstenberg's restaurant, where they met Josiah J. Vardaman, a dapper mulatto, who, along with his family, owned the Washington Tribune. After learning that Hearst's people had looked at the newspaper and were interested, Caroline bought the Tribune herself.
Later, Vardaman took her through the Tribune offices, a 3-story brick building with arched windows. The editorial offices overlooked Marketplace. The editor was a tall Southerner with red hair and side whiskers. "This is Mr. Trimble, the best editor in Washington, and a Washingtonian, too," Vardaman added. "What do you intend to do with the old Trib?" Mr. Trimble asked Caroline. "Why, be successful." Caroline's ears were now ringing. She wondered if she was about to faint. Was she mad, she wondered? More important, could she win? She was certain that in the war with Blaze she had just won a significant battle, if not the war itself. But Blaze was, oddly, secondary to the newspaper, which was hers. "You will see a lot of me, Mr. Trimble. I'm here for at least a year, maybe forever." "Are we to continue as before?" "Oh, yes. Nothing is to be changed, except the circulation." "How will you change that?" asked Vardaman. "Have you no murders to report?" asked Caroline. "Well, sure. I mean, we put the police news on the last page, like always, but it's just the usual, a body found floating in the river. Surely, from time to time, a beautiful woman is pulled out of the muddy, cold, dark Potomac River. A beautiful young woman, perhaps divided into sections and wearing only a negligee." "Caroline," murmured Cousin John. "The Tribune is a serious paper," said Vardaman, "devoted to the Republican Party, to the tariff." "Well, Mr. Trimble, let us never forget our seriousness. But let us also remember that a beautiful young woman, murdered in a crime of passion, is also a serious figure, if only to herself, while the crime, murder, is the most serious of all. In peacetime, that is." "You want, yellow journalism, Miss Sanford?" Trimble was staring at her. "Yellow? Ochre? Café au lait? I don't care what color." "But the Tribune is a newspaper," said Vardaman. "No," said Caroline. "It is not a newspaper, because there is no such thing as a newspaper. News is what we decide it is. We must be imaginative, Mr. Trimble." "I shall do my best, Miss Sanford." In the street, Cousin John turned on her with unfeigned anger. "You can't be serious." "I have never been more serious." "No." She stopped herself. "That's not true. What I mean to say is that I have never been serious about anything until now." During the next week, Caroline spent most of each day at the office of the Tribune. She got to know Mr. Trimble as well as she thought she should know an employee who was also a man and not a servant, a new sort of relationship for her. Most of her evenings were spent teaching Marguerite English. Dell was put off for the moment while she considered the awesome fact of matrimony in Pretoria, in reverse order, actually. On a Wednesday afternoon, Caroline was in the compositor's room studying the next day's front page with her printer. A cat slept on the windowsill, oblivious to the noises of Market Square. The black doorkeeper stood in the doorway. "There's a gentleman, miss, who wants to talk to the publishers, to Mr. Vardaman. He says he's from Mr. Hearst. His name's the same as yours." "Did you tell him who the publisher is?" "No, ma'am." "I'll see him in the office." Blaze was satisfyingly astonished. "You bought the Trib?" "I bought the Trib." They faced one another. "You did this to spite me." "Or delight me." "Sit down, Blaze." Sulkily, he turned a gilded chair backwards and straddled it as if he were riding a horse. "You can't be serious." "I've never understood why whenever someone is truly serious, someone always says that. Of course I'm serious. I'm working here as publisher and editor. Just like Mr. Hearst." Blaze laughed, without joy. "There's more to this than murders. How much do you want?" "I'm not selling." "Everything has its price." Caroline laughed. "You've been in New York too long. I might let you have half the paper, if you let me have my half of the—" "I won't give up any part of the estate," said Blaze. "I won't give up the Tribune, unless you go broke. Or sell it to Mr. Hearst, and not to you." Blaze was pale now. He looked exhausted. "Come," said Caroline graciously. "Let me show you the paper." Together they entered the long composition rooms. Trimble in shirt sleeves was correcting a galley at the long table. The cat was still asleep in the window. The city reporter was writing on a new typewriter machine bought by Caroline during the second day of her proprietorship. "This is the managing editor, Mr. Trimble." The two men shook hands. "My half-brother Blaze Sanford, he works with Mr. Hearst at the Journal. Now there is a paper. You know, last winter we heard a rumor that you people were going to buy us." "Since then Mr. Hearst has drawn in his horns," said Caroline. The political reporter, thin of neck, red of cheek and eye, already partly drunk, approached. "Mr. Trimble, here's an item from the White House. I was over talking to Mr. Cortelyou." "The President's secretary," said Caroline, helpfully, to Blaze. "He said there's no news from the Philippines. Then when asked what the President was doing at the moment, he said he's out driving, and I said, well, that's not much of a story, and he said, well, he's driving in a motor car for the first time, so there's an item, I guess." Trimble sighed. "A very smallish item, for the social page." "No," said Caroline, "for the front page." She had never felt so entirely heroic as she did now, showing off to Blaze. "What's the lead?" asked Trimble. "First president ever to drive in an automobile." "But is that true?" asked Trimble. "Mr. Hearst wouldn't care," Caroline replied. "And I'm afraid I don't either."
Admiral Dewey returned from Manila to a hero's welcome, while Caroline kept to her own bailiwick, learning the newspaper business. Marriage to Dell was postponed until he returned from Pretoria. Yes, she would come to South Africa to see him. No, she did not want a formal engagement. The 20th century began as Dell made preparations to leave. After a farewell party given by Henry Adams, Caroline set off with Dell and Helen for a moonlit sleigh ride to Chevy Chase.
"Russia must be like this, just like this," Helen exclaimed as they passed from town into open, snowy country. Dell's mother had insisted, without subtlety, that Helen join them on their last ride, and Caroline had been as pleased as Dell was displeased. Caroline got no joy from having her hand pressed beneath a sable rug, while a stolen kiss anywhere simply depressed her. She was not like other girls. She had accepted her uniqueness without distress. She was prepared, or so she thought, for everything, including the whole business of two anatomies entwined and the prickling of fig leaves or whatever. But she could not bear the step-by-careful-step American courtship. At least in Paris, marriages were business affairs, like the mergers of railroads. In Chevy Chase, they stopped at an 18th-century tavern and drank hot buttered rum in front of a great fire. At the next table, what looked to be 4 local farmers played cards in silence. Helen, tactfully, excused herself. "I wish you were coming to Pretoria." "So do I." Caroline was almost sincere. After all, was there anyone nicer than Dell? "But I've got the paper, and I've got Blaze to deal with." "Why does he take so hard a line with you? After all, you'll inherit anyway in a few years." "Because my plan misfired. He's more like me than I suspected. I thought he'd give way once I had something that he wanted. Now, of course, he'll never give way. Are you like that? If tested, yes, I think so. Anyway, that is the way I am with him. When we're married... Yes, Del. You won't go on, will you? You'd rather I didn't? Do you think it's the sort of thing a wife should do? There are, said Caroline sagely, wives and wives. But if I were to buy, oh, I'd warn you against buying. I owe you that much. You lose a great deal? We make a small amount. I have something for you. Caroline removed a small package from her handbag. Del opened it and took out a heavy gold ring in which was set a dark fire opal. This was my father's, said Caroline, suddenly uneasy. Had she gone too far? Opals bring bad luck, but it brought him good luck, and if it's your birthstone... As it's mine, he said, and slipped on the ring, and kissed her, as indifferent to the card players as those solemn men were to the young, now engaged couple. Look! He showed Helen the ring as she sat down. Good heavens! How beautiful! How daring! How unlucky! My father wore it and lived a long time. Happily, I suppose. He died in an accident, Helen began. Rather a better end than most of his contemporaries made, said Caroline. As a poet, I'm thrilled. Helen had published 1 volume of verse. As a sister, I think we should take a mutual vow of silence until you two are safely married. The three drank to that, and Caroline felt herself suddenly part of a most agreeable family, something she had never known at home and only caught glimpses of on visits to the houses of school friends. Was it possible, she wondered, as they took the sleigh back to the city, that she would not always be alone?
Despite a passion for the word reform and protestations that he did not want the nomination, Theodore Roosevelt was chosen by the Republicans as McKinley's running mate for the upcoming presidential election. Hearst moved to a brownstone off Lexington Avenue, became chairman of the National Association of Democratic Clubs, and started a newspaper in Chicago. His mother was in on the Homestead mines, and he was in the money again. With Del in Pretoria, Caroline was spending part of the summer in Newport, becoming acquainted for the first time with Blaze's grandmother, Mrs. Delacroix.
Curiosity had, finally, brought them together. When Caroline, vanquished at last by Washington's heat, had agreed to spend July with Mrs. Jack Astor, Mrs. Delacroix had written her that she must stay with what was, after all, the nearest thing that she had to a grandmother. And so Caroline had transferred herself from Mrs. Jack's to the splendors of the Grand Trianon, set high on Ochre Avenue above the bright, cool Atlantic, and from this sea-fragrant height the steaming heat of Washington was soon forgotten. Now she sat on the lawn of the Delacroix cottage and read the Tribune's accounts of the Democratic nomination of William Jennings Bryan. As a running mate, Bryan had selected Grover Cleveland's ancient vice president, Adlai Stevenson of Illinois. Caroline carefully compared the account in her paper to that of the rival press. It is curious indeed, said a deep feminine voice, to see a young lady reading the vulgar press and getting ink on her gloves in the process. Then I shall take off the gloves. Caroline dropped the stack of newspapers onto the grass and removed her white gloves. But I must keep on reading my competition and perfect my own vulgar art. Mrs. Delacroix was small and thin, with a face whose lines resembled an intricate spider's web, framed by silver-gray hair so elaborately curled and arranged, not to mention thick, that half Newport was convinced that she wore a wig, but hair and spider's web were all her own. A footman in livery appeared from behind a hedge of lilac and placed a chair behind Mrs. Delacroix, who sat in it without once looking to see if the chair was in place. You're the first young lady that I have ever known who reads the front part of the newspapers. I am the first young lady you have ever known to publish a newspaper. I would not, said Mrs. Delacroix, boast. Boast? I had hoped to arouse your sympathy. I have none. None at all? For anyone? Not even for myself. We get what we deserve, Caroline. Why must you quarrel with Blaze? We only quarrel over money. Surely that's usual and permissible. One disagrees over money, but one does not quarrel. You could be such a good influence on him. He thinks only of Mr. Hearst and newspapers. Like me. I sometimes think our wet nurse must have fed us ink instead of milk. Mrs. Delacroix put her hands over her ears. I did not hear that. A footman arrived with a silver tray on which 2 near-transparent cups of bouillon were placed. "Drink up," said the old woman. "You'll need your strength. We have a formidable season prepared." "You are good to invite me." Caroline looked at her hostess and began to be fond of her. Although she had not expected to find anything but a dragon, breathing fire, the invitation, summons, had proved to be a sign of belated, not quite affection, but deep curiosity. Of the two emotions, always the more interesting one in Caroline's view. But then, she too was curious about Mrs. Delacroix for many reasons. Thus far, there had been no talk of the past. A portrait of Denise Sanford hung in the drawing room. She looked very young and rather startled. Except for her expression, she looked like Blaise. There was no portrait of their father, William Sanford. What did the old woman feel about Caroline's mother, Emma? What indeed did she feel about Caroline as Emma's daughter? And why the sudden peremptory invitation that had taken precedence over the annoyed Mrs. Jack? There was a dance that night at the Elms, given by the Burke Roches. When Mrs. Delacroix announced that she was going home early, Caroline went with her. "Tomorrow," she said, "I must spend the morning on the telephone talking to Washington. When I was young, I danced all night. I was always in love." "I am not in love, Mrs. Delacroix, so I sleep and talk on the telephone." We enjoyed ourselves more. There were no telephones, of course. They were seated in the small study off the drawing room. Although it was late July, the night was cool and a fire was burning. Mrs. Delacroix held up a small painting on ivory. "This is your father, and my daughter." She was so happy. Can you tell? But Caroline, like the old woman, only saw what she wanted to see. Not the pretty, rather banal girl, but the round-faced, small-lipped young man whom she had never known and could not associate with the red-faced, loud figure of her own youth. "They were both happy," said Caroline, neutrally, and gave the picture back. "Your mother came here once in the summer of '76. She was beautiful. She was happy, too, wasn't she? My daughter Denise died giving birth to Blaise. Your mother was her best friend at that time. That is all before I was born." Caroline did not like the direction that the conversation was taking. "My father never spoke, to me at least, of his first wife. He seldom spoke of my mother, either. So, Blaise and I are motherless." "Yes, it is curious how Emma died in much the same way as Denise, as a result of giving birth." "Emma? At last, you have said her name. Now tell me, was she really so dark, and why?" Caroline hurled the question at the old lady, who visibly winced, then rallied. "Your mother," she said, most evenly, "killed my daughter, and that is the precise nature and quality of her darkness." Caroline had often observed women swoon, either from too tight corseting or as an act of desperate policy. She wondered whether or not this was a proper moment for her to experiment, entirely as a matter of policy, with a sudden dead faint. But she recalled herself. She would give blow for blow. How was this murder, as you do not quite call it, achieved? Denise had been warned that she could never have a child. Your mother encouraged her to have one, by the man your mother wanted to marry, even then, your father-to-be, Colonel Sanford. Caroline bared her teeth in what she hoped might be mistaken by firelight for a young girl's sweet smile. "I find no darkness there, only your surmise. How does one woman encourage another to have a child when each knows the consequences? There was a lady, I use the word ironically, who specialized in such matters. Emma sent for her. Emma got her to say, paid her to say, that Denise would survive. Since my daughter wanted a child very much, she had one. Then she died, and her husband went on to marry darkness?" "Yes. Then you were born, and in due course she died. Proper vengeance, I always thought. I do not believe your story, Mrs. Delacroix, nor can I understand why you choose to tell me so terrible a thing, assuming you believe what you've told me, when I am a guest, briefly, I may say, in your house." "I hope not briefly. I have taken you into my confidence because, when I am dead, I want you to tell Blaise the true story." "I suggest," said Caroline, "that you put it all in writing as part of your will. Let him find out at the same time he gets the money. If you like, I'll help you put it into French Alexandrines. They are particularly useful for this sort of theater. It is not theater, my child. I only want you to... Why want me for anything, since I am the daughter, in your eyes, of so much darkness? To Caroline's astonishment, Mrs. Delacroix crossed herself and whispered something in Latin. Then, I believe in atonement. I am to atone for my mother? I think you must. Besides, you and Blaise are all that's left of the Sanfords, the real ones, that is. So you must make up. This is one of the ways. I can think of less hazardous ways. I'm sure you could. In the falling firelight, the small room had taken on a rosy color, and Mrs. Delacroix looked almost girlish, spider webs erased. Blaise is in Newport. He is at Jamie Bennett Stone's villa. He has taken it for August. I'm sorry that I've kept him from staying here, with you. No, I want you here. He's close enough. Too close, perhaps, for me, Caroline said.
The next day, when Caroline went alone to the exclusive Bailey's Beach, she met Blaise and her eldest half-brother, the Prince d'Agrigent, known as Plon, who had recently escaped Paris, where he was separated from his wife. While Blaise played tennis, Caroline and Plon gossiped beneath a huge copper beech tree. As she watched him talk, Caroline realized that she was looking into her dead mother's eyes, and told him so.
So they say, Plon replied. What was she like? What was who like? Emma. Your mother. My mother. Oh, it was so long ago. She was American, like you. Do you think Emma might have killed the first Mrs. Sanford? You've heard the rumors? Only what everyone hears. She was, for me, adorable. When I went driving with her, I always hoped that people would mistake her for my mistress. Yes, I know, I am very French. I was also 14 when she died, and full grown for my age. I was prejudiced, of course, against your father. I thought him very American. The exact epithet I was searching for. He was very American, except that he had no energy at all. An impossible combination, we thought. But Maman always did her best to bring us together. She was very weak those last months, particularly after I was born. Yes, Maman just faded away. She would never have killed anyone. Then why the rumor? Plon gave a stage Frenchman's shrug. Rumors are eternal in our world. No, Sherry, if anyone killed the first Mrs. Sanford, which I doubt, it was your abominable father, who was capable of anything to get his way. Caroline felt as if she had been given a sudden electric shock. I don't believe you, was the best she could do. I couldn't care less what you believe. The dark eyes stared at her with an expression that she had never seen before. Could this be Emma? She wondered, looking so directly into her daughter's eyes.
McKinley and Roosevelt enjoyed an overwhelming victory in the November elections, although there were those who suggested that it was not McKinley but his glamorous running mate who had ensured the 1,000,000 votes by which the Republicans won. Caroline returned to Washington, and so did Dell, who appeared at her office with an invitation to lunch at the White House. When they arrived at the dining room of the presidential living quarters, Caroline was surprised to find Mrs. McKinley already at the table.
Ida McKinley was an epileptic who always sat next to her husband at tables so that when she went into convulsions, he could tactfully throw a napkin over her head and continue his conversation as though nothing had happened. When the convulsions ceased, he would remove the napkin and she would continue her dinner. Miss Sanford. Her voice was nasal, like a crow's cawing. I'm glad to see you again. Sit down here next to me. The Major sits on my other side. I don't know why Mr. Hayes' department fusses so when a husband and wife want to sit together at supper. After all, that's why you get married, isn't it? I'm not sure, Mrs. McKinley, but then I'm not married. Yes, said the First Lady and smiled. Well, you'll make a fine couple. And with money, too. The Major stood in the doorway, large and serene, eyes glowing with... Was it opium he was supposed to take? Caroline got up from her chair and curtsied. The President crossed to her. He took her hand and gently seated her again. I'm glad you could come, Miss Sanford. Sit down, Mr. Hay. Ida. Fondly he touched his wife's face. Fondly she kissed his hand. Lunch was as simple and as enormous as the President's dove-gray waistcoated paunch, which began very high indeed on his frame and curved outward, keeping him from ever sitting close to table. Quail was followed by porterhouse steak, which preceded broiled chicken, each course accompanied by a variety of hot breads, wheat muffins, corn sticks, toast, and butter. Butter flowed over everything, and the Major ate everything, while Ida picked at this and that. Dell, Caroline noted with alarm, kept pace with the President. Two of a kind, obviously. Would Dell be as fat? Across Caroline's future fell a shadow, every bit as large and fateful as President McKinley's stomach. The President spoke of his coming trip across the country. Mrs. McKinley will make the effort. Her doctor comes, too. In fact, I want the whole cabinet with me. Not everyone can get to see us here in Washington. Seems like everybody does, Mrs. McKinley said and frowned. But they don't, so we'll go to them. The President, Dell made his contribution, is going to speak out against the trusts. Have you been reading the New York Journal? McKinley asked. Not only am I the most hated creature on the American continent, their exact words, in spite of my re-election. You even beat Bryan in his home state. But I lost New York City by 30,000 votes. Anyway, the Journal's now written that if bad men can be got rid of only by killing, then the killing must be done. That is atrocious. Caroline was shocked. She was even more shocked that she had not seen the story. Dell explained why. After the first run, Mr. Hearst killed the story, so it wasn't in the later editions. For once, the yellow kid figured he'd gone too far, even for him. And Blaze, Dell added. All the more curious, said the President equably, because Mr. Hearst has just sent me one of his editors to apologize for the things they wrote about me during the election. When a Kentucky governor had been killed, Hearst's irrepressibly savage employee, Ambrose Bierce, had written a quatrain that had shocked the nation. The bullet that pierced Goebel's breast cannot be found in all the West. Good reason, it is speeding here to stretch McKinley on his bier. Hearst wants to be the Democratic candidate in '04, said Dell. He figures Bryan's had his last chance, now he's getting into place. I wish him luck. McKinley was mild. Then he asked Dell, Have you told her? No, sir, I've told no one at all. I'm appointing Dell Assistant Private Secretary to the President, with the understanding that when Mr. Cortelyou moves out and up, Dell will be Secretary. Dell turned pink with pleasure. Caroline saw immediately the eerie symmetry. It is the same position that John Hay had when he came to Washington with President Lincoln. I think it fitting. The President smiled, dried his lips with a napkin, just missing a shiny, buttery spot on his Napoleonic chin. Oh, that was so long ago. Ida was entirely in the present when she was not out of time altogether. But to look a long way ahead, said Caroline, 38 years from now, if you are like your father, you will be Secretary of State. In the year, McKinley paused, not so much to count as to marvel, 1939. What on earth will we be like then? Gone, dearest, said Ida, in heaven with our little Katie, and good riddance to everybody else. Blaze and Payne Whitney crossed the Yale Quadrangle, which was festooned with banners celebrating various class reunions. This was their third reunion, and Blaze had agreed to attend only because Caroline had said that Dell Hay would be there, the first member of their class to have made his mark in the world. You will be envious, she said, well pleased. Connecticut's high summer was tropical in its heat, and the air was fragrant with the scent of roses and peonies and the whiskey that the graduates were drinking from flasks as they hurried from party to party. Blaze and Payne were now at the edge of the pseudo-Gothic campus. Beyond a row of trees was Chapel Street and their hotel, the New Haven House. Are you Mr. Hearst's partner? Asked Payne as they crossed the street. I don't know. I don't think so. Blaze was never entirely sure just what his relationship to the chief was. Principally, he was a moneylender. He would have preferred to be an investor, but Hearst allowed no one to buy any part of a Hearst newspaper. Also, casual as Hearst was about money, he always paid back his debts to Blaze, with interest. Meanwhile, Blaze learned the business, learned it better in a sense than Hearst himself, for Blaze saw the business as just that, while Hearst, more and more, regarded his newspapers as mere means to an all-important end, his own presidency in 1904. Followed no doubt by a Napoleonic dictatorship and self-coronation. Although Blaze had no political ambition, he quite liked the power that went with the ownership of a newspaper. A publisher could make and break local, if not national, figures. Blaze had also watched, with a degree of fury, Caroline achieving what he ought to have done by now. She was taken very seriously in Washington because her newspaper was read and she no longer lost money. Inadvertently, he had driven her to be what he wanted to be, The irony of the situation was peculiarly unbearable. At the corner of the hotel, Blaze vowed to buy the Baltimore Examiner, jinx though it was supposed to be. He must start his life. There was a sudden eruption of young men and women from the hotel lobby into the street. Blaze and Payne were shoved against a wall. To Blaze's amazement, one of the young people was Caroline. In her right hand, she held high an empty champagne glass, as if she were about to propose a toast. "Caroline!" Blaze shouted. But if she heard him, she paid no attention, as she hurried to join the others now gathered in a circle on the sidewalk opposite an ice cream vendor. To an idle observer, it looked as if a dozen young people had been possessed, like so many medieval zealots, by an overpowering passion, if not for God, for ice cream. But then, as Blaze and Payne hurried to join the party, the ice cream vendor abandoned his livelihood and joined the circle, from whose center a loud cry sounded, chilling Blaze's blood. He had never before heard Caroline so much as weep, much less cry out like a wounded animal. Blaze pushed to the crowd's center, where he found Caroline on her knees, still holding the empty champagne glass carefully balanced, as if she were fearful of spilling its long-since spilled contents. In front of her, on his back, was Del Hay, arms and legs flung wide, akimbo, like a comic doll. Caroline touched Del's face with her unencumbered hand. Del's mouth was ajar, and blood streamed down his chin, while the gray eyes stared, intelligently, upward at his recent friends. "Caroline," Blaze murmured in her ear. She did not look at him, but she did give him her glass to hold. "He fell from the third floor," Caroline said. "He was sitting in the open window, talking to us, and leaned back and fell. Like that." Blaze helped her up. The others had now made a passage for two policemen who stared dumbly at the figure on the sidewalk. Then one of them squatted down and felt for the pulse in the right wrist. As he did, the hand flopped over, revealing a gold ring, without its jewel. "My ring," said Caroline. Blaze had never seen her so marvelously collected, or so entirely mad from shock. "The opal's gone." While the policeman examined Del for signs of life, Caroline got down on her hands and knees on the red brick sidewalk and searched for the missing jewelry. Amazed and embarrassed, bystanders stood back as she, politely, said over and over again, "I'm sorry. Do you mind moving? His ring is broken, you see. The stone fell out." "He's dead," said the policeman, who was now checking the neck for a pulse. Then he shut the staring eyes. "Oh, good," Caroline exclaimed. "I found it." She got to her feet triumphantly. "Look," she said to Blaze, as the policeman carried away Del's body and the crowd dispersed. "Here's the fire opal. For luck. For some, they say, but—" She frowned at the stone in the palm of her hand. "It's cracked in two. I wonder if it can be fixed." Caroline's hand shut over the stone. Blaze took one arm, Payne the other. "I'm sure it can," said Blaze. "Let's go inside." The lobby was dim and cool after the bright heat of the street. Just inside the door, Caroline became herself again. She turned to Payne. "How do we tell Mr. Hay?" "I don't know." Payne was now in shock. "Let Mr. Hay find out on his own." Blaze was practical. "There's nothing we can do that we've not done." Caroline put the broken stone in her handbag. "I should have taken the warning seriously. But opals are bad luck." Happily, they were joined by Marguerite, loudly wailing, and as Caroline comforted her maid, Blaze knew that she would be all right. On the other hand, he wondered briefly about the universe. Was it all right? Or was the whole thing meaningless and random and insensately cruel? "Why," asked Lizzie Cameron, "are autumn flowers darker than summer flowers, which are darker than spring flowers?" Elizabeth Cameron was now Lizzie to Caroline. They had become intimates. "Is that a question?" Caroline sat on the lawn, a shawl between her and the damp grass. "If it is, you've asked the wrong person. I was brought up to believe that what is out of doors should stay there and not be encouraged in any way." The French love flowers. Lizzie was assembling bouquets of zinnias and early chrysanthemums. She, too, sat on the lawn, a blanket beneath her. "But we like to discover them indoors, in vases. You're not afraid of chrysanthemums?" "No." "But then I'm not afraid of anything," said Lizzie, and Caroline believed her. "I'm glad Marguerite's not here. She would make a scene. Chrysanthemums are only for the dead, we believe. She believes, that is." "She will come back?" Caroline nodded. "The end of the month, when I go back to Washington. Thank you for my holiday." "Thank you? Without you, I would have gone mad in this house with only my loved ones to keep me company." "The senator's less restless than he was," Caroline said neutrally. Don Cameron was aging visibly and drinking invisibly. Although never exactly drunk in their presence, he was never entirely sober. Their daughter Martha was at what promised to be the sort of awkward age that might well last a lifetime. She was large, ungainly, unhappy, an exact opposite to her beautiful and gallant mother. Lizzie, wanting to do her best for the girl, did her worst. They had nothing in common but blood, that least of bonds. After Dell's death, Caroline had, with some misgivings, joined the Hay family in New Hampshire. She would have preferred to spend the summer in Washington's heat working at the Tribune, or even return to Newport, Rhode Island, and Mrs. Delacroix, but Clara Hay had been insistent, and so Caroline had gone to Sunapee to act the part of the widow that she might have been. When the Camerons had then invited Caroline to Beverly on Massachusetts' North Shore, Clara had insisted that she go. "They are so deeply interested in themselves that you won't have any time to think of yourself." Caroline accepted the invitation, then sent Marguerite back to France to see the inevitable ailing mother that every lady's maid possessed. The Camerons were indeed full of themselves, but as Caroline could never get enough of Lizzie, she was content to drift with them to summer's end. Now the sea wind was sharp with an autumnal chill. Soon the house, always sea-damp, would be shut up and the Camerons would go where? They were like so many Flying Dutchmen, each on a separate track, and only briefly, as now, did their courses coincide. They were joined by Kiki, Lizzie's small, overweight poodle, and Don Cameron on daughter Martha's arm. "There's still no newspapers," said Don, slowly, carefully, arranging his bulk on Lizzie's blanket. Martha stood, holding Kiki in her arms. "Anyway, we think we can pronounce the name," said Martha, and she pronounced Leon Sorgos, with two slushing sounds. "An anarchist," Don growled. "They're everywhere." "Very lucky, the Major," added Lizzie, reclaiming the faithless Kiki from Martha's arms. The four of them then proceeded to contemplate history.
A few minutes after 4 in the afternoon of September 6, 1901, in the Temple of Music of the Pan American Exposition at Buffalo, New York, President McKinley had been shot twice by a slight young man with a bandaged hand. Although one bullet had grazed McKinley's chest and the other had gone through his stomach, surgeons had been able to repair the points of entry and exit. After a feverish weekend, the president was pronounced out of danger. Meanwhile, the assailant, Leon Sorgos, was being closely questioned.
But at Beverly Farms, news was slow in coming. Don Cameron relied on visitors to bring him day-old newspapers. Kiki began to bark. Visitors had appeared on the piazza of the house. Brooks Adams and his wife, Daisy, waved to the group on the lawn. Then Brooks shouted, "Teddy!" "Teddy what?" responded Cameron. "Teddy Roosevelt," roared Brooks, "is President of the United States. 2:15 this morning, McKinley died. Gangrene set in." "Oh, God," murmured Cameron. Caroline crossed herself. The poor good McKinley was now as vanished from the story as Dell. Blaze found the chief in, of all places, his office at the Journal. As a rule, he preferred to work at home when he was in New York, which was seldom these days. In Hearst's capacity as presiding genius of the Democratic clubs, he traveled the nation, rallying the faithful, preparing for his own election 4 years hence. He had been in Chicago when McKinley was shot. The chief sat, feet on his desk and eyes on the window through which nothing could be seen except falling, melting snow. "How bad is it?" Blaze asked. Hearst answered, "Bad and getting worse." He gave him a copy of the New York World. Ambrose Bierce's quatrain was printed in bold type. Hearst's deliberate incitement to murder was the theme of the accompanying story. "They're trying to make out that the murderer had a copy of the Journal in his pocket at Buffalo. He didn't, of course." A sub-editor entered with a newspaper proof. "The President's message to Congress. We just got it on the wire." Hearst took the long sheets of paper and read rapidly. Leon, however his name's pronounced, was, according to our new president, inflamed by the teachings of professed anarchists and probably also by the reckless utterances of those who, on the stump and in the public press, appeal to the dark and evil spirits of malice and greed, envy and sullen hatred. The wind is sowed by the men who preach such doctrines, and they cannot escape their share of responsibility for the whirlwind that is reaped. Hearst made a ball of the sheets of paper and aimed it successfully at the wastebasket. I've been getting death threats, and Mr. Roosevelt's speech won't help. Well, we'll get him too one of these days. With another bullet to put him on his bier? Heaven forbid. Hearst turned pale. I hate violence. I was sick to my stomach when I heard about McKinley. Hearst then asked for news of the Baltimore newspaper, and Blaze told him the truth. It's just a stepping stone. To where? I want Washington. After all, you have everything else worth having. You could run one of my papers. You run them. I want my own. In Baltimore? The Examiner's a beginning until... But Blaze did not know where or what the until would be. She'd probably have sold if the Hay boy hadn't been killed. Hearst liked to analyze Caroline. I'm marrying Millicent Wilson one of these days. Blaze was surprised. Before the election? That part's up in the air. Well, I'll miss you around here. With that, Blaze was dismissed. He was no longer of financial use to the chief, whose mother's fortune was even larger than when her son first set out to spend it all.
After he left Hearst, Blaze had planned to travel to Baltimore, but he remained on the train to Washington, more occupied than usual by himself. He was 26, he was rich, he was attractive to women, yet he had made no effort to find himself a mistress, much less a wife. Plon had been amazed, and wondered if Blaze might not be in ill health, but since Blaze was as sturdy as a young pony, Plon had finally come to the sad conclusion that the illness was not of the flesh, but of the spirit. In Washington, Blaze arranged to meet Caroline at Mrs. Benedict Tracy Bingham's home, where tea was being poured for new members of Congress.
We're surrounded by Apgars, said Caroline, who met Blaze at the door. But Blaze could not tell an Apgar from anyone else in the crowded room, where the new congressmen and their ladies looked supremely ill at ease. A wiry young man with a full head of coppery hair turned to Blaze and said, You're Mr. Sanford, Caroline's brother. The young man's handshake was highly professional. You're one of the new congressmen? Despite the political handclasp, the young man seemed far too athletic and handsome to be a tribune of the people, but that indeed was what he was. James Burden Day, he said, and named his state and district. I was here before in the comptroller's office. That's when I got to know Del Hay and, of course, Miss Sanford. They exchanged condolences on Del's death. After he went off to Pretoria, I never saw him again. He was going to marry Miss Sanford? Day inserted a question in his voice. Yes, this month, I think. He was also going to join the president's staff, Blaze said. Poor Mr. Hay, said the young man, unexpectedly, and his pale blue eyes looked suddenly, directly, embarrassingly into Blaze's. With one hand, Blaze touched his own forehead as if to deflect by this meaningless gesture that sharp, disquieting gaze, and wondered why he should find Mr. Day disturbing. I'm Frederica Bingham. A pale blonde girl with a languid manner introduced herself. I know who you are, of course, but Mamma thinks that you should know who I am. Blaze could see that Day attracted her, and that he didn't. Caroline joined them. You have come back as you said you would. She greeted Day warmly. She, too, was attracted, Blaze could see. A storm of male resolve broke, behind his eyes, or wherever such storms break. One male, admittedly taller than he, had attracted two women. He must somehow establish his own primacy. Day pulled a small, plump, pretty woman to his side and said, This is my wife, Kitty. Caroline gave the woman her hand. But this is thrilling, she began. Blaze understood her disappointment. Since James Burden Day was uncommonly fetching, Blaze suspected that Caroline's phantom list of possibilities might once have included him. The speed with which Caroline now set out to charm Kitty convinced Blaze that he was right. Mr. Day never hinted that he might. And to you, she exclaimed. Oh, he is lucky. We are lucky to have you in Washington, aren't we, Blaze? Except you live in Baltimore. Oh, no, I don't, Blaze growled. But Caroline was not to be stopped. Was it so sudden? We heard nothing here. "Well, it was sudden," said Kitty. She had a low, nasal voice of the sort that Blaze liked least in a country where nearly everyone's voice got on his nerves. "We got married," said Day, "on Election Day. We'd always planned that," he added. After Frederica fled, Kitty spoke of houses and servants, and Caroline offered to help with both. When they moved off, Day turned to Blaze. "I hope we'll see you, now that you're nearby." "I hope so, too." Then Blaze added recklessly, "But I won't be nearby. I'll be right here." "In Washington?" "Yes, in Washington. New York's too far away, and Baltimore's nowhere at all. I'm looking for a house," he improvised, inspired by Caroline. "Then we'll see more of you. Won't be the same, though, without Dell." "I think I shall build a house," said Blaze, allowing for no sentiment. "In Connecticut Avenue. The best of country life, the best of village life." "She would never." Blaze lowered his voice, not that Caroline and Kitty could have heard either of them in the noisy room. "Never have married Dell." "What makes you so sure?" "I know her," Blaze lied. "Better than myself." Blaze told the truth.
On Easter, Caroline accompanied Mr. and Mrs. Trimble to the house of Mr. and Mrs. James Burden Day for tea. "We should get to know the Democrats," Caroline said to Trimble. But once there, she found that she was interested in only one Democrat, James Day himself, whose blue eyes studied her candidly over an angel food cake. As they talked, Caroline's head swam with metaphors involving food and sex. Marguerite had recently warned Caroline that if at 25 her virginity were kept for one more season, she would simply dry up. Finally, Day's lips shaped expected phrases as he told her where they might meet on Sunday after his dinner and ride.
As it turned out, he, not she, said, "I've never done this before." They lay side by side, entirely nude, not the modest way to couple in the United States, if the Tribune's ladies' page was to be trusted. Surely you and Kitty have at least tried to do what we've managed to do. Happily, Jim was as fascinated by Caroline as she was by him, and he kept caressing her as if not certain she was indeed real. "No, I meant that I haven't been with anyone since we—" His voice trailed off. "Well, I have been with no one at all." "I'm the first?" He stared at her with unattractive amazement. "Surely it's no martyrdom for you. One has to begin sometime with someone." Later, Jim, as she now called him, lolled contentedly in the tub, while Caroline followed Marguerite's instructions with an elaborate douching in a Lowestoft china basin, involving a cold tisane, guaranteed to discourage any little stranger from assembling itself in her no longer virginal loins. As she put on a silk peignoir, she wondered if she was going to be in love. She rather doubted it. After all, she lacked the first requisite. She was without jealousy, she had noted, watching him get into the tub. Kitty got to see this homely but also exciting spectacle every day, while she could only attend the miracle play on Sundays. Yet she did not envy Kitty. To have a man always with you, even one as well-proportioned and charming as Jim, was not a dream that she had ever wanted to come true. She had been a bachelor too long. "You and Kitty must come here to dinner," said Caroline when she was leading him to her bedroom door. Jim looked amazed. "Both of us?" "Well, it is usual to invite married couples together." "You'd like Kitty here?" "Very much. We have," Caroline smiled, "so much in common." "I guess you do at that." He could be as cool as she, and that would make their relationship all the easier, she decided, and smiled when she heard the front door slam. As it did, Marguerite, arthritis forgotten, hurtled into the room like a witch on the devil's breath, and embraced Caroline, weeping loudly, shouting her congratulations, mixed with cautionary do's and don'ts, and did she remember, and how was it? It. "I have come through, Marguerite." Caroline spoke to her in French, and felt a bit like Joan of Arc at the crowning of the Dauphin. "I am a saint. I mean, a woman. At last." "Praise God!" Marguerite positively howled.
Caroline, Blaze, and James Burden Day were guests of Mrs. Delacroix in Newport. Hearst had recently been elected to Congress, a foregone election since he had left nothing to chance, and he and Day had wanted to meet each other. Unfortunately, Day could only be in New York when Hearst was abroad. But Blaze had arranged a meeting with Brisbane, Hearst's editor, followed by an invitation to Newport, which Day had accepted without his wife.
Caroline stood over the commode in her bathroom and vomited. She felt as if she might turn herself inside out, so powerful were the spasms and of such long duration. She would not, she decided, ever commit suicide by poisoning. Then the spasms ceased. She washed her face in cologne, noting how red and swollen her eyes had become. Suddenly Marguerite was at her side. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" "Dear Marguerite, you of all people, how can you ask me that?" Caroline put down the linen towel. "I'm pregnant," she said, "in my 5th month." Then before Marguerite could cry out, Caroline placed her hand firmly over the old woman's mouth. "Maintenant le silence," Caroline whispered. Despite Marguerite's pleas, Caroline joined the yachting party. "I must seem absolutely all right," she said, until what? "I do what I have to do." This sentence released a torrent of mercifully silent tears. Actually, Caroline had no plan for the coming catastrophe. She must be cool, she told herself, do nothing rash, tell no one, certainly. The father of her child-to-be looked very handsome as he lounged on the afterdeck of the yacht, the unlovely bulk of Block Island just back of him. The other guests were in the main salon waiting for lunch to be announced. Although Caroline had been careful to avoid Jim, she had not been able to resist fresh air. "I probably shouldn't have come," Jim smiled, but Blaise insisted. "I'm glad you're here." Caroline managed to animate her voice. "Of course." She was pleased that, thanks to the shock of her situation, she felt no desire at all for him. He, on the other hand, was radiating sexual energy. She would have to discourage him, she decided, not quite certain what the etiquette of a pregnancy at this point required, or allowed. "You'll be going back to American City now?" Jim nodded. "On Monday. Kitty's pregnant." "Oh, no!" Caroline's astonishment was so genuine that she feared that she had given herself away, but Jim simply grinned. "Well, that's what you get married for, you know." "I don't. No, I can imagine, naturally." She was her usual self now. "Is she ill? I mean, does she have spells of sickness?" Jim nodded without much interest. "There's always a bit of feeling bad, I guess." "When will the child, that is, be born?" "October, the doctor thinks." The same month the Carolines would be due. He had gone from one bed to the other, perhaps even on the same day, like a rooster. For the first time, she realized just how dangerous the male was. Blaise appeared at the doorway. "Lunch is ready." For once, Caroline was grateful for his interruption. She had, suddenly, a plan. At exactly noon, Caroline entered the Waldorf Astoria's Peacock Alley, now largely deserted. Fashionable New York could not be found within 100 miles of the city, while working New York was largely shut down. Beneath a potted palm sat John Apgar Sanford, recently widowed, somewhat balder, somewhat grayer than the year before when they had last met in Washington, and he had reported his usual failure to budge Mr. Hoteling. Since she would inherit soon, no matter what, they had given up the case. "You didn't say in your telegram what you wanted to see me about, but I assumed it would be the case, so I've brought the key documents." He held up the leather case. "That's all right," she said, and seated herself opposite him. "It's not about the case, actually." She had rehearsed a number of openings, but none was right. "I have been thinking," she said at last, in lieu of inspiration, "about getting married." "I suppose that's natural, of course." John seemed unsurprised, also uninterested. "Soon there will be the inheritance." She played her great card at once. "Yes, you will be very well off indeed." "From what I gather, Blaise did not do what we feared. There are still certain loans to Mr. Hearst outstanding, but Mr. Hearst is good for them. Otherwise, the inheritance is intact. I hope," John smiled wanly, "you are not being married for your fortune." "No, I don't think that enters my calculation so far. Is patent law so difficult?" John looked surprised. "It's not difficult, no, but it's not easy to make a living at it. I've changed firms, as you know, but my wife's long illness—" The voice trailed into embarrassed silence. "Things have not been easy for you, John. I know that. I'm sorry, truly," she added, pleased by her own display of warmth. She quite liked him. She also liked very much her liking him. "You once did me the honor of proposing to marry me. I've now thought over your proposal. Somewhat slowly, I admit. It's been, 4 years at least. And I accept. It was done. Caroline decided that John's look of astonishment was not the greatest tribute ever paid her. But Caroline, you cannot say this is so sudden, John. Caroline was beginning almost to enjoy herself. No, only I never dreamed. I can't think what to say. You can say yes, dear John, or you can say no. I accept either, but I can't accept indecision. Well, yes, of course, but I've lost everything. We were, my family that is, wiped out 2 years ago when the Monongahela Combine failed, and then her illness. I have enough for 2. Or I will have soon. I shall be able to help you financially. That would be mortifying. John was acutely uncomfortable. A fair exchange is no robbery, as the French say, so I shall explain exactly what is to be exchanged for what. I know that you are, of all the family here, the most worldly, the most experienced. Caroline saw fit to lay it on rather heavily, as she was by no means certain what his response was going to be. In marrying me, you will not only get the support that you need in your, endeavors, but will be able to provide me with a father for my child. John had gone pale. John had misunderstood. Naturally, in marrying, the thought of a family is all important to me to carry on the name. I was not speaking of a future hypothetical fatherhood for you, but of an imminent motherhood for me. In October, to be precise, which is why I am eager to be married this week at City Hall, where I have already made inquiries. John gasped, but at least he had understood. You... But he exhausted all his breath in startled exhalation. As John inhaled, Caroline said, Yes, I am pregnant. I cannot tell you who the father is, as he is a married man, but I can tell you that he was my first and only lover. I see. John stared at his shoes. I realize that I am asking for a very great deal, which is why I said at the very beginning that there would be an exchange between us, useful to each. Will you continue to see him? No. Caroline lied so seldom that she found it quite easy to do. What will you do about the newspaper? I shall go on with it, unless you would like to be the publisher. No, I'm a lawyer after all, not a publisher. I must say, I have never come across a case like this. I thought that pregnant ladies were always getting married in the nick of time. Yes, but to the man who made them pregnant? Well, that is not possible for me. You are in love with him. John was bleak. Don't worry, John. I shall be as good a wife as I can, given my disposition, which is not very wifely, in the American way, that is. I suppose you will want to look at my books. I'm not an auditor. You have debts. I'll pay what I can now. When I inherit, I'll pay the rest. I assume that your debts are not larger than my income. Oh, much less, much less. When Caroline rose from her chair, John sprang to his feet. Yes, he was hers, she decided. So far, so good. Now all that needed to be worked out was the marital bed. She had no intention of sleeping with John, and it was plain that he had every intention of claiming his conjugal rights. For the moment she was safe. Her family history of difficult, even fatal pregnancies could be invoked to keep him at a distance. Later, she would, she was certain, think of something. Caroline took John's arm as a wife takes a husband's. Dear John, she said, as they made their way down the deserted Peacock Alley. It's like a dream, said John. Exactly what I was thinking, said Caroline, who had never felt more awake.
Caroline's daughter, Emma Apgar Sanford, turned out to be less noisy than Caroline had anticipated, and though not the best of company, was a benign presence in the Georgetown house. Caroline had planned to move to larger quarters, but John's liabilities had used up her own income for the year. Since the newspaper had begun shyly to flourish, she could live comfortably as a Mrs. Sanford in Georgetown, instead of the Mrs. Sanford, which she would not be until March 5, 1905, some 15 months in the future. She suspected that John, who was mostly in New York with his law firm, had even greater debts than he had admitted to. But even more worrisome, she suspected that Blaise knew just how insolvent her bridegroom was, because Blaise had recently suggested that she sell him the Tribune if she were so minded. but she was not so minded, and told him so.
Blaise stared a moment at the door to the house in Lafayette Square exactly opposite the White House. All in all, he decided, it was a tribute to the energy and colorfulness of Theodore Roosevelt that this less-than-splendid house, formerly rented by Elihu Root, John Hay's successor as Secretary of State, was now occupied by Representative William Randolph Hearst. Plainly, it was Roosevelt's powerful magnetism that drew to sleepy backward Washington Hearst and himself. The familiar, corpulent George opened the door, just as if they were still in a real city instead of this curious southern village. "Mr. Blaise, you're a sight for sore eyes." Over the years, George had come to regard Blaise as the chief's younger brother, or even son, a role Blaise had never once had any desire to play. But play-act both men must, the omnipotent Hearst, publisher now of 8 papers, and the wealthy Blaise, who had still to make his mark at anything, particularly since yesterday's disastrous fire had destroyed his Baltimore printing press. The Baltimore Examiner would not appear for several weeks. Hearst sat, enthroned, in the wood-paneled study, listening to a small and, to Blaise, perfectly appalling Georgian named Thomas E. Watson, who had served a term in the House as a member of the Farmers' Alliance, been vice-presidential candidate of the Populist Party, might now be the populist candidate for president in 1904. Currently, Hearst was desperately wooing him to support the Democratic Party. Jim Day was seated on a sofa facing Hearst. He greeted Blaise with a smile and continued to listen to the tiny, fiery Watson, who stood at the room's center declaiming. Watson spoke for another half-hour. Then, with a peroration on the absolute necessity, if the United States were ever to know greatness, of a rural free mail delivery service, he stopped. "What do you think, Jim?" Hearst turned to Day after Watson was gone. Blaise was, suddenly, completely jealous. They were on a first-name basis, something rare for Hearst to be with anyone. "I think Colonel Bryan's going to try again. And I'll be with him, as always, and he'll fail to be nominated, so I guess you'll be the candidate." Hearst turned to Blaise. "Sorry about the fire. I guess you'll start up again, won't you?" "Next week. There's a chance that Caroline might sell me the Tribune." Blaise had put Hoteling to work, increasing the pressure on Sanford's edgy creditors. If a crisis could be provoked. "I'd love to get my hands on that paper." Hearst was wistful. "You know, if I'm nominated, I'm going to give the Democratic National Committee $1.5 million for the campaign." Jim whistled, then smiled. "Why after you're nominated? Spread it around before and you will be nominated." "Roosevelt," declared Hearst somberly, "has all sorts of luck." "Except bad," noted Jim. "There's never been anything like him. I hate him, I think. He calls me McKinley's murderer. Why don't you suggest that he hired that anarchist to kill McKinley so that he could become president?" Blaise improvised for Jim's amusement. "We were never able to find a connection," said Hearst, sadly. "Well, when in doubt, make something up." Jim was cheerful. George announced, "Miss Frederica Bingham," to Hearst's surprise. Blaise rose. "I asked her to meet me here. We're going to look at my new house. She's got ambition as a decorator of houses. She's read Mrs. Wharton's book." The Connecticut Avenue house was a vast, and to Blaise's eye, a beautiful rendering, in a modern way, of Saint-Cloud-le-Duc. Frederica told him exactly how to decorate the various rooms, and he was pleasantly surprised to discover that he did not in the least mind so much advice. As they talked, Blaise thought seriously of marriage, not to Frederica, but to someone suitable, who would be able to look after the house, not to mention Saint-Cloud-le-Duc. But the more Blaise studied the field, the less any one person appealed to him. He had even considered going back to Paris, but that would have been an acknowledgment of defeat, for him, and a victory for Caroline. Mr. and Mrs. John Apgar Sanford occupied a small suite of the Blair Benton Hotel in Market Street, the main street of St. Louis. "We were lucky to get even this," said Sanford, indicating the bedroom with its single four-poster bed. He had duly noted Caroline's displeasure. They did not, except in emergencies, ever share the same bed. When Sanford had told her that a number of his inventors and their business sponsors would be at the World's Fair, and that he, as their patent attorney, was expected to be on hand to examine all the exhibitions and determine whose patent was being infringed, Caroline had told him she thought he should go. When the Tribune's best reporter took ill, Mr. Trimble had convinced Caroline that she should herself describe the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, as it was properly called, at least the inaugural ceremonies. Caroline was eager to attend, since John Hay would be making an address which would be the opening gun in the coming battle for the presidency. Although Clara Hay had proposed that the Sanfords join them in their private car, Caroline had spared the Hays and the Adamses the experience of John, who had grown more and more glum. No bad thing, but more and more apologetic for his life. A very bad thing indeed. There was no doubt that Theodore would be nominated by the Republican Party in June. There was little doubt that he would beat Bryan or Hearst or Parker or any Democrat in November. John went through a file of papers with a worried frown. "Is there any news?" he asked Caroline. "Yes, I went to the Jews," as Mr. Adams would say. These particular Jews are a Yankee firm by the name of Whitaker. They are devoted Presbyterians. I asked, as you requested, for $500,000 at the going rate. Why did they say no? John had now been a husband long enough to be able to finish Caroline's sentences, if not enter, as it were, her bed. A single attempt to fulfill their conjugal duties had failed. Each had been apologetic. Caroline had given what she thought was a convincing performance of a devoted wife. She had even, against her by now better judgment, followed Marguerite's advice, which was to shut her eyes and imagine that the large body on top of her was that of James Burden Day. But the smell was wrong, the texture odd, the attack askew. Blaze is making it appear that the estate is in trouble, or non-existent, or that there are obscure liens or your rights unclear. John the lawyer was far better company than John the husband. "I'm joining some of my clients for lunch. I may be able—" He did not finish the sentence. He would try to borrow money. So would she. "I must join the Hays. He speaks this afternoon at the exposition. Perhaps—" She did not finish her sentence either. But Caroline had plans which did not include the Hays. Instead, she walked in the warm sunlight along the levee, crowded with visitors from out of town. At a waterfront saloon called the Anchor, she paused. As far as she could see along the levee, black men were loading and unloading cargo from barges, ships. James Burden Day, in statesman's black, approached her from the saloon. "What a surprise," he said, and looked at his watch. "You're exactly on time." They made love in Caroline's suite at the Blair Benton Hotel. Jim was nervous that he might be recognized, but the lobby was so crowded that no one could actually see anyone. Also, Caroline was now something of an expert on the use of hotels. Whenever she planned to meet Jim, she insisted on a first-floor suite in a hotel with at least 2 separate stairways from ground to first floor. Jim thought that had she been a man, she would have been a natural general. Caroline watched Jim dress, a sight almost as pleasing as the reverse. He watched her, watching him, divined her mood. "You're thinking about money," he said. "It's lack," she said. "John has got himself, us, that is, in the deepest water, and Blaze has seen to it that I can't borrow." "Why can't you borrow? Next March it's all yours anyway. Bankers love that sort of short-term loan. How can Blaze stop them from lending?" "By lying, through his lawyers, pretending the estate is compromised." "That's easily investigated." Jim sat in a rocking chair and rested his head on a spotless antimacassar. Caroline got out of bed, began to dress. "In time I could straighten all this out, but there's no time. Blaze has been putting pressure on John's debtors. If he does not pay up now, he will be ruined." "You will have to sell to Blaze." Jim was flat. "I would rather die." "What else?" "Other than death? Other than a sale. You could keep control, if he will let me." Jim stared at her in the mirror, where she was now repairing the damage that Eros does to even the simplest coiffure. "Why not let John go under? He's the one at fault, not you." "Because, my darling, he knows who the father of my child is." Caroline enjoyed Jim's look of astonishment. "But he's the father, isn't he?" "No, he's not." There was a long silence, broken by Jim's sudden laughter. He sprang to his feet like a boy and embraced Caroline from behind, kissed the nape of her neck, causing the hair, controlled at last, to come crashing down. "My child? Emma's mine, too?" "You sound like a horse breeder." "Why not? I am the acknowledged stud. Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you." "How does John know it's me?" "He doesn't. I was just being dramatic. All he knows is that Emma is not his. When I discovered I was pregnant, I told him, and he married me. It was my money for his, For my respectability. Why didn't you just pretend it was his? Because I've never really been to bed with him. Jim whistled, an engaging, rustic sound. You really are French. Caroline was not amused. You would be surprised just how American I am, particularly in a situation like this. I am not about to lose. But this, she knew, even as she spoke, was hollow boasting. She was about to lose, the Tribune. Shall I work on Blaze? He seems to like me. More than that is my impression. Jim's head suddenly filled with blood. The face became scarlet. I don't know what you mean. Which means you know exactly what I mean. He's like a schoolgirl around you. Caroline rose from her dressing table, armored for the day. Seduce him. That is definitely French. No, it's English, actually. Would you really want me to? You might like it. After all, Blaze is much better looking than me. I don't think I could, even for you. Jim held her carefully about the waist as they walked to the door. But I guess I could sort of flirt with him, maybe. You American boys, Caroline said. The Jefferson Hotel in St. Louis was the headquarters of the William Randolph Hearst for President Committee. Hearst himself had a suite on the floor directly above the humble single room of William Jennings Bryan, a lowly delegate at large from Nebraska. On the 4th of July, Hearst was nominated by a San Francisco politician, a friend of the late Senator George Hearst. Blaze sat with Caroline and John Sanford in the press gallery of the huge airless hall. After the nominating speeches for Hearst, the California delegates held a parade around the floor of the convention. Blaze was surprised at how genuinely popular the chief had become. Of course he has no chance, said Caroline, rising from her wooden folding chair. Let's go get some air. I'm about to faint. For the delicate business at hand, Blaze had selected a riverboat. The owner had offered Blaze a suite when it was discovered that every hotel in the city was booked, and so he had now, all to himself, the wonders of the Delta Queen. It was moored to the levee near Market Street. At the gangplank, a single guard saluted Blaze casually and bade them all welcome. A steward received them on the first deck and escorted them into an echoing mahogany bar, lit by a single bronze gas lamp, beneath which sat the pink-whiskered Mr. Hoteling. Blaze was relieved to find his ally in place. Now it was 2-2. Before, he had felt outnumbered by Caroline and John, 3 rather than 2-1, since Caroline had, in a sense, doubled herself through accomplishment, while he had diminished himself by non-success. Mr. Hoteling rose, the dentured smile ghastly in the light from overhead. Mrs. Sanford, Mr. Sanford, Mr. Sanford. Least one has no trouble with names. A figure stepped out of the shadows and said, I'm Mr. Trimble, not Sanford. Blaze felt, again, outnumbered. But he greeted Trimble politely. Then the 5 of them sat at a round table, and the steward brought them champagne with the compliments of the owner. Sanford began, for the enemy. You've had a chance to study the Tribune's financial status? Yes, Mr. Hoteling said. All is in order, according to my accountant. We are willing to pay for 50% of the shares. Caroline, not her lawyer husband, spoke. 48% of the shares are up for sale, not 50%. Sweat rolled down Blaze's left side, tickling him mercilessly. We agreed to 50-50, you and I. So we did. So it is, she said. I will sell you 48% of the shares. I will keep 48% of the shares. That's 50-50. We, you and I, will own exactly the same amount, as agreed. Who owns, asked Mr. Hoteling, the remaining 4% of the shares? I own 4%, said Trimble. Mrs. Sanford wanted to give me a bonus when the paper was in profit. I said I'd take the bonus in the form of stock. It was my understanding, Mr. Hoteling began. I thought it was all cut and dried. Sanford was now himself triumphantly cut, dried, thought Blaze. Sister would sell brother half her shares for $156,000. That was the meaning of 50-50. That was not my understanding. Blaze got to his feet. I see no reason to go on with this. He looked at Caroline, who smiled and said nothing. I'm sorry if there's been a misunderstanding. Sanford did not sound in the least sorry. There always is, said Caroline suddenly. We specialize in misunderstandings. It's a family trait. What looks to be a 1 to one of us appears as a 7 to the other. Blaze sat down heavily. Caroline acted as if nothing untoward had been said. If you would rather not buy, I'll go to Mr. Hearst, who will be a publisher again tomorrow. I'll buy 48% of the shares at the agreed-on price. Blaze heard his own voice as though it were someone else's, far off, strange. 2 men in uniform joined them. Caroline signed first. Blaze signed second. The ship's officers signed. Trimble raised his glass. "To the Washington Tribune," he said.
Bryan did not come to Hearst's aid, as the chief had hoped, and a judge, Alton B. Parker, was chosen by the Democrats as their presidential nominee. After the balloting was completed, Blaze found himself alone with Jim Day at the main entrance to the convention hall. Even sweating and tired, Jim was masculine energy and youth incarnate.
"I'm going to bed," said Jim. "I've got a room on the riverboat." Blaze waved for a cab, courtesy of the owner. "You won't be uncomfortable?" "No," said Blaze as they got into the cab. "To the levee," he said to the driver, and turned to Jim. "It's closer. And why wake Kitty?"
In November 1904, Roosevelt was duly elected in the greatest Republican victory since 1872. But Hearst's political confidence was still unshaken. He was running for mayor of New York, and had plans for the governorship in 1906 and the presidency in 1908.
"I've got to start a third party," Hearst said to Blaze. "That's the only way. Or knock off half the politicians in this country, which I could do if I really wanted to get even." When Blaze asked how this might be done, the chief looked very mysterious indeed. "I've got a lot of research on everybody. I know a lot now. But I can't say how, or what." As it turned out, 2 weeks later, Blaze knew what the chief knew. The Tribune was now housed in a new building in 11th Street. Blaze's office was on the first floor, in one corner. Caroline was installed in the opposite corner. In front of Blaze stood a well-dressed young Negro who had been admitted after considerable discussion by Blaze's disapproving stenographer. In Washington, even well-dressed Negroes were not encouraged to pay calls on publishers. The fact that the young man was from New York City had apparently tipped the scale, and Mr. Willie Winfield was admitted. "I'm a friend of Mr. Fred Eldridge." Winfield sat down without invitation. "Who," asked Blaze, perplexed, "is Mr. Fred Eldridge?" "He said you might not remember him, but even so, I was to come and see you anyways. He's an editor at the New York American." Blaze recalled vaguely such a person. "What does Mr. Eldridge want?" "Well, it's not what he wants. It's maybe what you want." "So what do I want?" "Information about people, big wigs, like senators and that stuff. You know John D. Archibald?" "Standard Oil?" "Yeah, the same. He looks after politicians for Mr. John D. Rockefeller. Well, my stepfather is his butler in the big house in Tarrytown, and Mr. Archibald, a fine man, by the way, got me this job as an office boy at 28 Broadway, where the Standard Oil is." Blaze tried not to look interested. "I'm afraid we've no openings here for an office boy," he began. "Oh, I'm out of that business now. Me and my partner, we're opening up a saloon on 134th Street. Anyways, me and my partner, we went through Mr. Archibald's files, where he has all those letters from the bigwigs in politics, who he pays money to so they'll help Standard Oil do different things. Anyways, I happened to come across Mr. Eldridge about that time, last December it was, and he asked me to bring the letters round to the American where he could photograph them, and then I could put them back in the files so nobody'd ever know they was ever missing." Hearst had the letters. That was plain. But how would he use them? More to the point, how would, or could, Blaze make use of them? "I assume Mr. Eldridge told you that I might be a customer for the letters?" "That's about the size of it. Mr. Hearst paid us pretty good for the first batch, then a couple of weeks ago Mr. Archibald fires us, my partner and me. I guess we didn't always put things back in the right order or something." "Does he know which letters you photographed?" Winfield shook his head. "How could he? He doesn't even know that any of them was photographed." "What have you got to sell?" Blaze asked. "Well, when we was fired, I'd taken out this big letter book for the first half of 1904. I've still got it." "Then you'll go to jail when Mr. Archibald reports the theft." Winfield's smile was huge. "He won't report nothing. There's letters in there from everybody. How much he paid this judge, how much he paid that senator, and other things, too. I offered to sell it to Mr. Eldridge, but he says the price is too high, and Mr. Hearst's got enough already." "Did you bring the letter book?" "You think I'm crazy, Mr. Sanford?" "No, But I made out a list for you of some people who wrote Mr. Archbold thanking him for money paid and so on. Could I see the list? That's why I'm here, Mr. Sanford. 2 sheets of paper were produced, each filled with neatly typewritten names. Blaze put them on his desk. Where once railroads had bought and sold politicians, now the oil magnates did the same, and Mr. Archbold was Mr. Rockefeller's principal disperser of bribes and corrupter-in-chief. The names, by and large, did not surprise Blaze. One could tell by the way certain members of Congress habitually voted who paid for them. Blaze was relieved not to find Jim's name on the first page. He picked up the second page. The first name at the head of the column was Theodore Roosevelt. Blaze put down the page. "I think," he said, "we can do business." The day after Roosevelt's inaugural ball, Caroline celebrated her 27th birthday with Blaze and 2 lawyers, one her husband John, the other Mr. Hotling. The celebration began in her office at the Tribune, where various documents of transfer were signed and witnessed and countersigned and notarized. Caroline now had what was hers, while Blaze, in possession of half of what was hers, was marginally better off. To be a half-publisher of a successful newspaper was better than being a non-publisher, or the custodian of the Baltimore Examiner. "Now," said Hotling, as the last set of signatures had been affixed, and Caroline had become a number of times a millionaire, "in the matter of the Saint-Cloud-le-Duc property, the will of your late father neglects to make clear which of you inherits. In law, then, a court would doubtless find that you own it jointly, as you do the rest of the estate, and should the property be sold, you would divide evenly the money from the sale. Is that agreeable?" He looked at John, who looked at Caroline, who said, "Yes," and looked at Blaze, who shrugged and said, "Okay." "I want it for May and June," said Caroline. "I miss the place." "I'll come in July and August," said Blaze, "for my honeymoon." "Good," said Hotling, who never listened to anyone except when specifically paid to. Caroline looked intently at Blaze, who was now wiping ink off his middle finger. "Frederica?" "Yes, we're getting married in May." "Then you must have St. Cloud. For May, that is. We can all stay there." Blaze was equable. "Congratulations," said John, and formally shook Blaze's hand. Hotling had now put away his documents in a leather case, and still unaware of his client's approaching marriage, bade them all good-bye, with a sentiment that, after nearly 7 years, all must be well that had ended so well. Blaze suggested that Caroline join him and Frederica for dinner that night at Harvey's Oyster House. "And you too, John," he added, and left the room. In recent years, Caroline and John seldom looked at each other directly, nor very often aslant either. "Well, it's over." John took out his pipe, filled and lit it. "How is Emma?" "She flourishes. She asks for you. I've talked to Riggs Bank. They will start making monthly payments into your account, as we agreed." John stood up and stretched himself. He looked years older than he was, and the face was now of the same gray as the hair. "I suppose you'll want a divorce." "I suppose so. Would you like one?" "Well, it's for you, really, to decide. You see, I have no future." "What makes you think I have one?" John gave a wan smile. "Heiresses cannot avoid having a future. It's your fate. You will remarry." "To whom?" "Emma's father." "Out of reach. For good. Kitty might die." For the first and last time in their marriage, John astonished her. "How did you know?" "I have eyes, and Emma has his eyes, and Emma can talk now, and she speaks of his Sunday visits. With pleasure, too." "You haven't spied on me." "Why should I? It's no business of mine. What business I ever had with you is concluded, and yours with me." "I trust," said Caroline, rising from behind her roll-top desk, "you will always be a lawyer to me." "And you a client to me." John smiled and shook her hand formally. "You know, I did want to marry you when you first came over. I mean, really marry you." Caroline felt a sudden strong emotion which she could not identify. Was it loss? "I'm afraid that wasn't meant to be. No fault of yours, though perhaps of mine. You see, I wanted to be all myself, but had no real self to be all, or even part of. I think I make no sense." Caroline was suddenly flustered. It was not her way to speak so personally to anyone, even Jim. Shall I divorce you or you me? Oh, divorce me. Caroline had regained her poise. For desertion, that's fashionable now. In the Dakotas, which should be lovely in the summer. I shall notify you legally. Here. To her amazement, he gave her his handkerchief. Then he left. To her amazement, she found that she was weeping. Blaise sat at the edge of an artificial lake and watched the swans sail back and forth, greedy eyes alert for food, predatory beaks ready to strike any land creature that moved within range. He was content. If he had no inherent talent for marriage, Frederica had more than enough for two. With every show of amiability, she and Caroline each had taken over a wing of the chateau, and each kept to her wing unless invited by the other for a visit. The state wings were held in common, under the jurisdiction of the butler who was also in effect the estate manager. Monsieur Brissac had been at the chateau for 30 years. It was he who hired and fired and stole discreetly. It was he who had known both Mrs. Sandfords, and never a word of the slightest interest to say about either. Now the old man approached Blaise from the central part of the chateau. He bowed low and presented Blaise with a telegram which he opened. Millicent and I and 4 others will come to lunch May 30, Hearst. It was typical of the chief to give only a day's notice. As Blaise gave orders to Monsieur Brissac, Caroline and Emma appeared from the woods. Emma ran forward to her uncle, who picked her up and listened to her chatter in a combination of French and English. She had her grandmother's complexion, hair. The chief arrives tomorrow for lunch with 4 lords-in-waiting. He does us honor. Caroline sat in one of the curious carved sandstone thrones that the builder of the chateau, in a frenzy of premature Pharaonism, had sculpted beside the lake. With the beautiful Millicent? Blaise nodded. He's very respectable now. He expects to be elected mayor of New York in the fall. Poor man. But I suppose it will give him something to do. Caroline put out her hand. The key. To what? Father's desk. I want to read Grandfather Schuyler's memoirs. There's a journal he kept during the years that he knew Burr. There is also a journal, which I've never looked at because my mother, I think it was she, wrote on the cover, Burn. The desk's open. They're in 2 leather-bound boxes. Have you read them? I don't like the past. That's where the key is, if there's one, of course. Come on, Emma. As Caroline collected her child, Blaise said, Why did you divorce? Why not? It's very American of you. I am very American. Anyway, I wasn't married in the church. It doesn't count, really, for us anyway. It's just a legal convenience, just another key to another lock. Blaise was still mystified by the whole affair. Was John with someone else? Caroline's laugh dispelled any suspicion along that line. I wish he were. Are you? Blaise was convinced that Caroline had for some time been having an affair, but she was even more guarded than he about her life. I wish I were. Caroline echoed herself and was gone. Blaise found the chief rather less phlegmatic than usual. He had gained so much weight that had he been shorter he might have presented to the world a comforting McKinley-esque rotundity, but because of his height, the result was more ursine menacing than McKinley majestic. The 2 couples with the Hearsts were part of his publishing life. After lunch, Blaise and Hearst walked together by the lake. I want to know about Willie Winfield. Blaise was direct. Hearst stopped in mid-stride. How do you know him? Blaise was cool. He came to me at the Tribune. He said he had been stealing letters from Mr. Archbold and that he'd taken them round to one of your editors at the American, and the editor would photograph them. Then you paid, he said. Hearst scowled down at Blaise. You paid, too. A statement, not a question. Blaise smiled. Not for the same letters, unfortunately. I bought a part of the first half of the 1904 letter book. I didn't buy that one. So what are you going to do? Although Hearst's physiognomy did not allow for displays of indecision or apprehension, the weak voice was suddenly, oddly, tremulous. I don't think I have any use for the letters. Hearst's physiognomy could not betray relief, either. He stared blankly at Blaise, who said, I don't think that the Tribune as a Washington paper should get too mixed up in these things. If there's a crusade for good government again, we might join in. Or Caroline might. I'm happy with bad government. You're in it, like it or not. There's no alternative. Hearst was flat. You'll sit on the letters? I think so. But Blaise intended to keep Hearst in suspense as long as possible. I'm only interested in 1 letter, 1 politician. Roosevelt? Blaise nodded. The letter I bought can only be interpreted in its proper context. Well, I don't know the context. Do you? Hearst's thin smile was slow and genuine. It's the way the thing looks that matters. And I'll use what I've got, or not use it, in connection with my own campaign in 1908. Blaze did not like to use to himself the word blackmail, but that was indeed the chief's intention. As the owner of 8 popular newspapers and the Archbold letters, he could make the leaders of the Republic leap through any hoop of his choice. Blaze realized that Hearst might yet become president, and if he did, he might surprise everyone. In what way, of course, it was hard to tell. Caroline sat at the large marquetry table and opened the 2 letterboxes. The first contained fragments of Aaron Burr's autobiography. She glanced through the pages and decided that Henry Adams, if no one else, would be fascinated. The second letterbox was a final journal by her grandfather covering the year 1876. He had returned to New York for the first time since 1836 with his daughter, Emma, the Princesse d'Agrigent. This was the volume that she intended to read carefully. Once the Hearst party had left, Caroline spent every moment that she could reading her grandfather's journal. She was charmed by his amusement at the strange American world, fascinated by his description of her mother's campaign to find a wealthy husband, the object of the visit, appalled by her grandfather's cynical complacence. But then father and daughter were broke, and he was just able to support the 2 of them by writing for the magazines. As Caroline read on, she began to see something alter in Emma's character. Alter, or be revealed to the reader, Caroline, but not to the narrator. Sanford made his entrance with wife Denise, who could not give birth without danger. As Denise and Emma became closer and closer friends, Caroline found that her fingers were suddenly so cold that she could hardly, clumsily turn the pages. Caroline knew the end before the end. Emma persuaded Denise to give birth to Blaze. In effect, Emma murdered Denise in order to marry Sanford. Emma's expiation was the long, painful time she took to die after Caroline's birth. But did Emma feel guilt? Did she atone? Confess? Caroline sent for her half-brother, Plon. It was late afternoon. She wanted to talk to her mother's oldest son from an earlier marriage while the crime was still vivid in her mind. Plon sprawled handsomely on a sofa. Caroline told him what their mother had done. At the end, somewhat dramatically, she held up the journal and waved it in the air, told him of the murder. "You knew it all along, didn't you?" Plon shrugged. "I thought something had happened." "Did she say anything?" "Of course not. You know, when somebody becomes Emperor of the French and conquers all Europe, he doesn't brood much about the people he killed." "But she was a woman, and a mother, not Emperor of the French." "You don't know how. I don't know how she saw herself. She had to survive, and if a sad lady, her friend, Blaze's mother, must die naturally in childbirth, then die she must." The next morning, Caroline invited Blaze to breakfast in her wing of the chateau. He knew why. Plon had told him. "Now you know," he said casually, "that your mother killed my mother for our father's money. I'm sure it happens all the time." Don't make a joke of it. Now I know why your grandmother was so insistent with me. I am to expiate. You? Don't exaggerate your importance. You weren't even there. I, at least, was the direct cause of my mother's death. I think these things go on into the next generation, and further, maybe." Blaze laughed into his omelet. "I believe in character, and I certainly believe in cause and effect and consequence," she went on. "The consequence is that you and I are still fairly young by the standards of our world, and very rich by any standard. This isn't the house of Artois. Atreus." She corrected him from force of habit. Plon sounded as if he would have done the same. "I doubt it. Men are never as cruel as women when it comes to this sort of thing. Look at your dismissal of John. That was very Emma-esque. I couldn't have done that." Caroline felt a chill in the room, which turned out to be not a ghost, but a sudden wind from the lake, a summer storm on its way. Blaze closed the window. "You prove my point, then," she said. "The old crime." "Don't be carried away. Think of all the new crimes we can commit. Let poor Emma rest in peace. I have never once thought of Denise. Why should you think of Emma, who, according to Plon, except for one nicely executed murder, was delightful as a woman, and admirable as a mother?" "You are immoral, Blaze." Caroline wanted to be shocked, but felt nothing at all. "I never said I wasn't," he replied. Although Hearst lost the election for mayor of New York in a three-way race, he came within a handful of votes of winning it. Only a last-minute burning of ballots by Murphy of Tammany Hall had secured the election from McClellan. Hearst was now behaving like a Shakespearean tragic hero in search of a fifth act. With remarkable skill, he had created his own political machine within New York State, and now he was prepared to seize the governorship with Blaze's help. The Republican candidate was a distinguished, if dim, lawyer, Charles Evans Hughes, known as the scourge of the corrupt insurance companies. He was considered no match for Hearst, whose fame was now total. At the end of October, on a bright, cold morning, Blaze boarded Hearst's private car, Riva, on a railroad siding at Albany. He was greeted by the inevitable George. "It never stops, Mr. Blaze. The chief's in the parlor. Mrs. Hearst won't get out of bed. I can't wait till this is over." To Blaze's relief, Hearst was alone, going through a stack of newspapers. The blonde hair was turning, with age, not gray, but a curious brown. He looked up at Blaze and smiled briefly. 7 in the morning's the only time I've got to myself. Blaze settled in an armchair and a steward served them coffee. "The animated feather duster," Hearst's name for Charles Evans Hughes, "is getting nowhere. No organization, no popular support." Hearst gave Blaze a general impression of the campaign thus far. The entire Democratic ticket seemed to be winning, and Hughes could not ignite popular opinion despite the anti-Hearst press, the entire press not owned by Hearst, which was outdoing even Hearst himself when it came to inventions and libels. But the voters appeared unimpressed. "I've never seen such crowds." Hearst's pale eyes glittered. "And they'll be back in 2 years' time." What about the Archbold letters? For Blaze, the letters were the essential proof of the rottenness of a system that could not survive much longer. Either the people would overthrow the government, or more likely the government would overthrow the people and set up some sort of dictatorship or junta. Blaze suspected that if it came to the latter, Roosevelt would do a better job than Hearst. "I don't need the letters. I'm winning. The letters are for 1908 in case I have problems. You see, I'll be the reform candidate then." "If I were you, I'd use them now. Hit Roosevelt before he hits you. Why bother? There's nothing Four Eyes can do to me, in this state anyway." The following Sunday, Blaze arrived at Caroline's Georgetown house. On the first of the year, she would move into her new house in DuPont Circle. Blaze knocked on the door. There was no answer. He tried the door handle. It turned. As he stepped inside the entrance foyer, Jim Day appeared on the staircase, tying his tie. For an instant they stared, frozen, at each other. Then Jim finished his tie as coolly as he could. The face was attractively flushed, the way it had been on the riverboat in St. Louis. "Caroline's upstairs," he said. "I have to go." They met on the stairs, but did not shake hands. As Jim passed him, Blaze smelled the familiar warm scent. Caroline was in her bed, wearing a dressing gown trimmed with white feathers. "Now," she greeted Blaze, "you know." "Yes." Blaze sat opposite her in a love seat. "It is all quite respectable. Since Jim is Emma's father, we must keep this in the family. Don't you agree?" "Yes." Blaze saw the whole thing clearly at last, including the otherwise meaningless marriage to John. It would be the end of him if Kitty knew. "Or the beginning." Caroline was airy. "The world doesn't end any more with an affair. It does in politics, in this state. If she were to divorce him, I'd fill the breach as best I could. That's not the worst fate, is it?" "For him, probably." Blaze was, obscurely, furious. But what might have been obscure to him was blazingly plain to Caroline. "You're jealous," she teased. "You want him too. Again." Blaze thought that he might, like some human volcano, erupt with blood. "You bitch. If you try to make trouble between Jim and Kitty, or Jim and me, your night of passion aboard the riverboat, with poor Jim doing his innocent best to give you pleasure, will be as ruinous for you as anything you can do to him or to me or to poor blind Kitty." Caroline swung her legs over the side of the bed and put on her slippers. "Control yourself. You'll have a stroke one of these days, and Frederica will be a widow, as well as my best friend." In the back of Blaze's mind there had always been the thought, hope, that he and Jim might one day reenact what happened aboard the riverboat. But ever since, the embarrassed Jim had kept his distance, and once again, Caroline was triumphant. From the Tribune to Jim, Caroline had got everything that he had wanted. In the presence of so much good fortune, Blaze was conscious of a certain amount of sulfur in the air. But for now, at least, he must be cool, serene, alert. The White House thinks that Hearst will win. Caroline was at her dressing table rebuilding her hair. So do I. So does he. So does the animated feather duster. Secretary of State Root is going to Utica. The president is sending him. To Hearst. Too late, Blaze muttered. Mr. Root carries great weight in New York. As the president's emissary, I would be nervous if I were Mr. Hearst. But all Blaze wanted to speak of was Jim, and that, of course, was the only subject that he and Caroline could never again mention to each other. Blaze was with the chief in New York City when the Secretary of State spoke in Utica. It was the 1st of November. The weather was peculiarly dismal, even for New York, and a drizzle that was neither snow nor rain made muddy the streets. Hearst had his own newswire in his study. Blaze was at his side as the message from Utica came through, even as Root was speaking. As read, line by line, the speech was lapidary. The short sentences were hurled like so many knives at a target, and none missed. Absentee congressman, hypocrite capitalist, false friend of labor, demagogue in the press and in politics, pitting class against class. Well, said the chief with a small smile, I've heard worse. But Blaze suspected that he was indeed about to hear worse, and he did, toward the end. Root read Ambrose Bierce's quatrain calling for McKinley's murder. Hearst stiffened as the familiar words stuttered past them on the wire. Root quoted other Hearstian indictments of McKinley, inciting the mad anarchist to murder. Then Root quoted Roosevelt's original attack on the exploiter of sensationalism, who must share equally in the murder of the beloved by all President McKinley. Hearst was now very pale, as the thin ribbon of text passed through his fingers to Blaze's. I say by the President's authority that in penning these words with the horror of President McKinley's murder fresh before him, he had Mr. Hearst specifically in mind. The son of a bitch, whispered Hearst, when I finish with him. The message went on, and I say by his authority that what he thought of Mr. Hearst then, he thinks of Mr. Hearst now. So, it would be on the charge of regicide that Hearst was to be brought down at last. Blaze marveled at the exactness with which Roosevelt, using Root for knife, struck the lethal blow. Hearst turned to Blaze. I want you to go over the Archibald letters with me. I will never again be a candidate, but I shall continue to live in New York and educate and support the principles of reform which I have always stood for. Thus, William Randolph Hearst withdrew from politics as a candidate. But Blaze knew that the chief would be even more formidable than before. Free of the wheeling and dealing required of a man canvassing votes, Hearst could not only do as he pleased, but if he chose, transform the republic itself. Somehow whenever Blaze thought of Hearst, no longer remotely the chief to him, he thought of unopened crates. He had acquired everything, tangible and intangible, and then never got around to unpacking what was his and making sense of it. Currently, literally unopened crates provided the only furniture in Hearst's new home, the Clarendon apartment building at the corner of Riverside Drive and 86th Street. Hearst had taken over the top 3 floors, some 30 rooms. At the very top, the 12th floor, Hearst and Blaze went over the Archibald letters, spread across the width of a huge refectory table from Spain, pitted with newly drilled wormholes as guarantee of antiquity. What happens if Archibald brings charges against you for theft? Blaze asked. I didn't steal anything. I just copied some letters offered me pro bono publica. Pro bono publico. That's what I said. I wish I could make more out of Theodore's letters. Hearst looked wistfully at the short, enigmatic letters from the White House to Archibald. Within the right context, they could send the president to jail, but there was no context at all to these anodyne texts. Of course, one could cook something up. I wouldn't, said Blaze firmly. I won't, until I have something to go on. I have detectives at work, going over his bank accounts. He's terrified. Next Sunday I'm dropping some hints in all the papers that we have his letters to Archibald. Compromising letters. Blaze was beginning to feel that the impossible was about to happen. Hearst was actually going to go too far. Unless the detectives turned up something new, Hearst was about to find himself in the dangerous position of one who has accused of corruption a popular president in office. All I've got to do is smoke him out. I do think he's corrupt, by the way. I mean, everyone in this business is, to raise money to run. But because he's a hypocrite, he's worse than the others. That's why I want to keep him guessing. My ace is this. He doesn't know how much or what we know, and he'd give anything to find out. Hearst had agreed that Blaze might use certain letters that he himself had no immediate use for. The powerful Senator Penrose was given to Blaze, and a half-dozen members of the House. In exchange, Blaze would use the Tribune files to back up the Hearst investigation, if that was not too lofty a word for what Hearst was doing. Blaze was at his desk in Washington when Caroline made an announced entrance. The first, in fact, since each had seen fit to confide to the other more truth than was necessary for everyday life in the American Republic. "Look," said Caroline, who seldom said anything so obvious. Blaze spread out the New York Journal-American on his desk and read the headline, "W.R. Hearst proves the rule of oil trust in politics." He read the story quickly. Someone, probably Brisbane, had put together a highly damning account of Standard Oil's promiscuous dealings with the politicians of both parties. With some subtlety, the story never got far from Roosevelt and the Republican Party, but thus far no line of Roosevelt was quoted. That was, the story concluded, to come. "I suspect this will not be a happy morning at the White House." Caroline sat down. "Well, he's done one thing I didn't think he could. He's proved that Standard Oil gave a lot of money to Roosevelt's campaign, and Roosevelt, so far, hasn't really gone after any of the oil trusts. Well, that's cause and effect, isn't it?" "But," said Caroline, "Archbold also contributed to Judge Parker and the Democrats. So the two cancel out. I wonder." Blaze turned to Caroline. "Do you and Mr. Trimble agree to breaking the Penrose story?" Caroline nodded. "Mr. Trimble's running it tomorrow. Front page. That puts us one ahead of the Post." Blaze was pleased. "Hearst wants to do the best of Sibley's letters, but we can have the rest of him, the part that doesn't concern the president." Joseph C. Sibley was a Republican congressman from Pennsylvania who had never tried to disguise his loyalty to the Rockefeller oil interest. Sibley wrote Archbold, "For the first time in my life, I told the president some plain, if unpalatable, truths as to the situation politically, and that no man should win or deserve to win who depended upon the rabble rather than upon the conservative men of affairs. Have you ever thought of going home?" Caroline was sudden. "Home? To Connecticut Avenue?" "To France." Blaze laughed. "No, I like it here, more than ever. Besides, do you know anything about French politics? Look what they did to your friend Captain Dreyfus." Caroline seemed uncharacteristically disconsolate. "In France, we wouldn't be publishers. We wouldn't have to know such people, or care." Blaze shook his head. "Sell me your share and go back. I'm in my element now." Caroline smiled with pleasure. "That famous shoe keeps shifting, first to one, then to the other foot. Oh, I stay. I'm in too deep. I have my expiations. You and that mother of yours." Blaze disliked the subject intensely. "You don't need expiation. What you need is an exorcist." "I want to publish my grandfather's journal about her." "Go ahead. It's none of my business," said Blaze, and meant it. Then Mr. Trimble joined them, a note in hand, a gleam in his eye. "From the White House. From the President." "Never explain," sighed Caroline. "Never complain." "He's done both." Trimble gave them the short message for publication. The President had no specific recollection of the conversation as reported by Mr. Sibley. "The President would like to see you tomorrow at noon." This was addressed to Blaze. Then Trimble was gone, and Blaze said to Caroline, "We have drawn blood." "Whose, I wonder?" asked Caroline.
At their meeting the next day, Roosevelt gave Blaze a typed statement that he asked to be run in the Tribune. It praised Hearst for rendering a public service in publicizing the Archbold letters. It further stated that the president would be delighted to have published any letters of his own dealing with Standard Oil affairs. Thus Roosevelt made the best of a bad business by praising the enemy and trying to regain for himself the high ground in what looked more and more like a swamp filled with quicksand.
Although William Randolph Hearst had been requested to enter the White House from the South Side, where private visitors came and went, the great man ordered his chauffeur to drive up the main driveway to the north portico, to the general consternation of the police. Then slowly, like some huge bear of the sort that the president liked to shoot in quantity, while roaring about the necessity of the preservation of wildlife, Hearst entered the main hall of the house, which he would never, short of an armed revolution, occupy. The chief usher led Hearst to the west wing. When told to wait in the secretary's office, Hearst opened the door to the empty cabinet room and took his place at the head of the table. The secretary's shock was silent, but profound. Hearst sat back in the chair of state and shut his eyes, like a man exhausted in a noble cause. He was home, but not for long. As usual, noise preceded the chief magistrate. "Delighted you're here." The president was now at the door of the cabinet room. Hearst opened his eyes and gravely nodded his head in greeting. For a moment, Roosevelt appeared uncertain what next to do. Then he shut the door behind him. There would be no witnesses to what might follow. Slowly, majestically, Hearst got to his feet. As the two men shook hands, Hearst deliberately pulled Roosevelt toward him so that the president was obliged to stare straight up into the air at the taller man. "You wanted to see me?" Hearst inquired. "Indeed, indeed. We have so much to talk about. Sit there, on my right, Mr. Root's chair." Hearst's smile was thinner than usual as he pulled an armchair from its place at center table, putting a considerable distance between himself and the president. "I'd fear some terrible contagion if I were to sit in the chair of so notorious a liar." Roosevelt's face was now dark red. "I've never known Mr. Root to lie. He spoke for me in Utica." "Well, I didn't think he was speaking on oath to God. Of course he spoke for you when he accused me of McKinley's murder." The conversation was plainly not going where Roosevelt had intended. "Your press incites violence and class hatred. Do you deny that?" "I don't deny or affirm anything. I'm here at your request, Roosevelt. Personally, I have no wish to see you at all, anywhere, ever. Unless, of course, we share the same quarter in hell. So I must warn you, no one says, 'Do you deny?' to me in my country." "Your country, is it? When did you buy it?" "In 1898, when I made war with Spain and won it. All my doing, that was, and none of yours. Ever since then, the country's gone pretty much the way I've wanted it to go, and you've gone right along, too, because you had to." "You exaggerate your importance, Mr. Hearst. You, the owner, no, the father of the country, couldn't get the Democrats to nominate you for president, even in a year when there was no chance of their winning. How do you explain that?" "First, I'd say it makes no difference at all who sits in that chair of yours. The country is run by trusts, as you like to remind us. They've bought everything and everyone, including you. They can't buy me. I'm rich. So I'm free to do as I please, and you're not. In general, I go along with them simply to keep the people docile for now. I do that through the press. Now you're just an office holder. Soon you'll move out of here, and that's the end of you. But I go on and on describing the world we live in, which then becomes what I say it is. You have raised, Mr. Hearst, the Fourth Estate to a level quite unheard of in any time. I know I have. And for once you've got it right. I have placed the press above everything else except maybe money, and even when it comes to money, I can usually make the market rise or fall. When I invented, I should say, the war with Spain, all of it fiction to begin with, I saw to it that the war would be a real one at the end, and it was. For better or worse, we took over a real empire from the Caribbean to the shores of China. Now, in the process, a lot of small fry like you and Dewey benefited. I'm afraid I couldn't control the thing once I set it in motion. No one could. I was also struck with the fact that once you start a war, you have to have heroes. So you, of all people, came bustling along, and I told the editors, all right, build him up. So that's how a second-rate New York politician wandering around Kettle Hill, blind as a bat and just about as effective, got turned into a war hero. But you sure knew how to cash in. I'll hand you that. Of all my inventions, you certainly leapt off the page of the Journal and into the White House. Roosevelt stared at the painting of Lincoln on the opposite wall, the melancholy face looking at something outside the frame. Well, Mr. Hearst, I was aware of your pretensions as a publisher, but I never realized that you are the sole inventor of us all. He arranged several statute books on the table. What do you know about me and Mr. Archibald? Standard Oil helped finance your last campaign, everyone knows that. Have you any proof that I asked for the money? The asking was done by others, you only hint. Hearst's voice was dreamy. I'm going to drive many men from public life. I'm also going to expose you as the hypocrite you are. You will have an easy time with the Sibleys and Haskells. You will have an impossible time with me. You fight the trusts? Hearst asked. As best I can. Have you ever objected to Standard Oil's numerous crimes against individuals, not to mention the public? I have spoken out against them many times as malefactors of great wealth. But what? Hearst's voice was soft. Have you done to bring Standard Oil to heel? You've been here 6 years. What have you done except rant in public and take their money in secret? You will see. Roosevelt was very calm indeed. Next year we bring suit against them in Indiana. Next year? Who says this is not my country? I've forced you, of all people, to act against your own kind. Because of what I've revealed this year, you'll do something next year. But you don't ever really lead. You follow my lead, Roosevelt. Hearst was on his feet, but Roosevelt, not to be outdone, had done his special jack-in-the-box rapid leap to the perpendicular, so that technically the president had risen first, as protocol required, ending the audience. At the door to the cabinet room, Hearst got his hand on the doorknob first. You're pretty safe for now. I wonder, said Roosevelt softly, if you are. It's my story, isn't it? This country. The author's always safe. It's his characters who better watch out. Of course, there are surprises. Here's one. When you're out of a job and need money to feed that family of yours, I'll hire you to write for me. I'll pay you, whatever you want. Roosevelt produced his most dazzling smile. I may be a hypocrite, Mr. Hearst, but I'm not a scoundrel. I know, said Hearst, with a mock sadness. After all, I made you up, didn't I? History invented me, not you. Hearst parried. Well, if you really want to be highfalutin, then at this time and in this place I am history, or at least the creator of the record. True history comes long after us. That's when it will be decided whether or not we measured up, and our greatness, or its lack, will be defined, Roosevelt replied. True history, said Hearst, with a smile that was, for once, almost charming, is the final fiction. I thought you even knew that. Then Hearst was gone, leaving the president alone in the cabinet room, with its great table, leather armchairs, and the full-length painting of Abraham Lincoln, eyes fixed on some far distance beyond the viewer's range, a prospect unknown and unknowable to the mere observer, at sea in present time.